I still remember the look on his face when he said it, that half-smirk that cuts deeper than any insult. "You're broke, Grandpa. You should just sell that old cabin before it falls apart." He laughed, and everyone at the table followed. I just smiled, the way quiet men do when they have already decided their next move. I drove home that night under the Oregon rain, headlights flickering against pine trees older than his arrogance. Broke? Maybe in his eyes. But I had something he didn't. Time, patience, and a lesson waiting behind a wooden door he thought was worthless. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The restaurant shimmered with soft amber light and polished glass. Conversations overlapped with the clink of wine glasses, the kind of Portland place where menus had no prices, because anyone who needed to ask didn't belong there. Arthur Mitchell stood near the entrance, straightening the cuffs of his well-worn jacket. He felt slightly out of place amid the designer suits and curated laughter, but his face carried a calm composure that made waiters pause before asking if he needed assistance. At the center table sat his grandson, Ethan, 27, perfectly groomed, his voice cutting through the noise, with the confidence of someone who believed the world had already declared him successful. "Investors loved our pitch," Ethan boasted, waving a hand as if brushing away invisible praise. "Old industries are fossils. I told them we're the future." Laughter followed, sharp, performative, a chorus of young ambition. Arthur smiled faintly and made his way over. Ethan noticed him mid-sentence. "Grandpa, you made it." His tone was more surprise than warmth. Sarah, sitting beside her son, smiled tightly. "Dad, sit down. You remember Ethan's friends?" Arthur nodded, shaking polite hands. He took a seat quietly, absorbing the energy around him. Expensive watches, shiny phones, the scent of imported cologne. He listened as Ethan kept the spotlight squarely on himself, talking about venture capital, pre-seed rounds, and market disruption. It was a language Arthur understood only through observation, not belief. When the waiter arrived with the dessert, a candlelit stack of something artisanal and overdecorated, Arthur reached into his coat pocket. "I brought you something," he said, setting a small box on the table. The paper was neatly folded, sealed with a simple strip of tape. Ethan tore it open between bites of cake, his grin fading when he revealed the contents, a weathered brass compass, its face scratched but still gleaming beneath the candlelight. Ethan blinked. "A compass?" Arthur nodded softly. "It belonged to my father. Helped me find my bearings when I was your age." For a moment, silence stretched thin across the table. Then Ethan laughed, short, sharp, and dismissive. "You really are broke, huh?" The words landed heavier than he expected. Laughter rippled uncertainly among his friends, the kind that seeks permission to exist. Sarah's smile vanished. "Ethan, that's enough," she said, her voice a tremor between embarrassment and anger. But Ethan shrugged, unfazed. "Come on, Mom, it's a joke." Arthur didn't flinch. His eyes, a soft blue dulled by years of loss and patience, stayed on his grandson's face. He closed the compass lid with a slow click, the kind that felt final. "I suppose it still points north," he murmured, slipping it back into his pocket. No one spoke. Even the waiter hesitated before clearing plates. Lydia Rhodes, seated a few spots down, silver hair, sharp eyes, watched Arthur closely. She had known him long enough to recognize that kind of silence. It wasn't defeat. It was the quiet before something deliberate. "Arthur," Sarah whispered, reaching for his hand, but he was already rising. "I should get going," he said, polite as ever. "Happy birthday, Ethan." Ethan's confidence faltered briefly. "You're leaving already?" Arthur gave a small smile. "I think I've seen what I needed to." He nodded to the group, then to Lydia. "Good evening." Outside, the air was crisp and forgiving. The city lights blurred in the windshield of his old pickup as he stepped to the curb. Inside the restaurant, laughter resumed. Softer now, less certain. Lydia excused herself soon after, but from the window she saw Arthur pause beside a valet, struggling with another car. He slipped a folded bill into the young man's hand, a tip far larger than the job deserved. "Thank you, sir," the valet said, startled. Arthur smiled faintly. "You're welcome, son." He climbed into his truck, the leather seat creaking beneath him. The engine coughed before steadying into its patient hum. As he drove off into the city night, the compass sat beside him on the passenger seat, glinting faintly under the dashlight. He didn't look at it, didn't need to. The direction had already begun to change. Somewhere behind him, in that bright restaurant full of shallow applause, a line had been crossed. Arthur didn't plan revenge that night, not consciously. But as the road curved toward the quiet hills beyond Portland, something settled in him. He whispered into the hum of the tires, almost to himself, "Let them think I'm broke." The truck's taillights disappeared into the dark, leaving behind laughter that would soon taste like regret. The following afternoon, the echo of that birthday dinner still hung in the air, like smoke that refused to clear. Ethan was back in Portland, recounting the story to his friends in their private group chat, the kind where emojis outnumbered empathy. One of them had snapped a photo of Arthur's old pickup truck parked outside the restaurant. The faded red paint, the dented bumper, the quiet dignity of something built to last. Within minutes, the image was filtered, captioned, and turned into a meme. Boomer Broke starter pack. Another followed, Arthur's face crudely pasted beside rusted tools and a coupon book. The thread exploded with laughing reactions. Ethan added his own comment. "That's my grandpa. Still thinks hard work beats Wi-Fi." The cruelty was casual, but it spread fast. It was the kind of joke that wasn't meant to hurt, yet carried the exact shape of humiliation. Sarah saw it by accident that evening. She'd borrowed Ethan's iPad to check her emails, only to have the notification banner slide across the screen. Boomer Broke memes trending in the group chat. Curiosity turned to horror as she opened it. Each post was a punch, her father's face, his truck, his gift, laughter bubbling around them like smoke over a fire. Her stomach twisted. She didn't call Ethan immediately. She couldn't find words sharp enough to cut through what she felt. Instead, she closed the app, set the device down, and sat still for a long time. That night, she drove across town to Lydia's apartment, knocking softly even though the hour was late. Lydia opened the door in her robe, concern flickering instantly. "Sarah?" Sarah held out the iPad like evidence. "He can't see this. Please don't show him." But Lydia, ever the realist, scrolled through the thread silently, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. "He should know," she said finally. "Hiding it won't change what it says about them." The next morning, Arthur was in his garden trimming back ivy from the fence when Lydia arrived. She handed him her phone without preamble. "You should see this." He took it, squinting at the screen. The image of his own pickup truck stared back at him, overlaid with text. "When you're too broke to Uber but too proud to ask for help." Beneath it, laughing emojis, digital applause. Arthur scrolled slowly through the feed, meme after meme, the careless cruelty of the young captured in pixels. His face didn't change. Lydia waited for something. Anger, disappointment, even a sigh. But nothing came. "You're not angry?" she asked quietly. Arthur handed the phone back. "Not yet." That was all. He turned back to his pruning, steady, methodical. His silence unnerved her more than any outburst could have. Later that night, the house was still. The grandfather clock ticked with the rhythm of years gone by. Arthur sat alone in his study, the soft light from an old desk lamp falling across a collection of framed photographs. His late wife, Marianne, smiling by the lakeside cabin they'd once dreamed of finishing. Their daughter as a child, barefoot in summer grass. He traced his finger along the frame, whispering to the empty room, "They've forgotten how I built all this." The words carried no bitterness, only ache, a quiet wound where pride used to sit. From the doorway, Lydia's voice broke the silence. "Then maybe remind them." Arthur looked up, eyes weary but alert, as if a long dormant part of him had stirred. "Remind them?" he echoed softly. "People remember lessons longer than lectures," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "And you've always been a builder, Arthur. Maybe it's time to build again." He didn't answer. The lamp's glow reflected off the brass compass resting on his desk. He reached for it, turning it slowly in his hands, the needle trembling until it found north. Outside, wind moved through the pines, carrying the faint scent of rain from the hills. Arthur stood, crossed to the window, and looked toward the dark outline of the forest beyond the town, the one that hid his old lake property, long untouched. Something in his gaze sharpened, not vengeance, not yet, but direction. Behind him, the clock chimed midnight. The sound was steady, patient. Arthur whispered to the glass, barely audible. "Let's remind them." The drive to Arthur's home took Ethan longer than he remembered. The narrow country road wound between pine trees that pressed close like silent witnesses. His sleek electric car hummed uneasily over the cracked asphalt, the contrast between machine and wilderness almost mocking. By the time he pulled into the gravel driveway, a layer of dust coated the rims, and his patience had thinned to irritation. The old house stood at the edge of the property, not broken, but weathered. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the railing bleached gray by years of Oregon rain. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, curling through the cold morning air. Ethan hesitated, eyeing the old truck parked nearby. That truck, the same one his friends had mocked in the memes. It looked smaller here, humbler, but strangely dignified against the green and gold of the land. Arthur opened the door before Ethan could knock. "Didn't think I'd see you up this way," he said softly. His voice carried no accusation, only observation. Ethan forced a smile. "Wanted to check on you, Grandpa. It's been, what, a few years?" Arthur stepped aside, closer to 5. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and black coffee. The furniture was mismatched but clean, old armchairs that had seen decades of conversation, a dining table scarred with history instead of neglect. Arthur moved slowly to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee, one into a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Engineer," the other into a plain white one with a crack running down the handle. Ethan frowned as Arthur handed him the cracked mug. "You should probably replace some of this stuff," he said. "I mean, this place. It's nice, but you could sell it before it just rots away." Arthur stirred his coffee, the spoon clicking softly. "I'll leave it when it's finished." Ethan blinked. "Finished? Grandpa, this place is half decayed. You've been tinkering with it since Mom was a kid." Arthur smiled faintly, eyes on the window. "Some things take a lifetime." Ethan chuckled, the sound dry and dismissive. "You'll die before that." The words hung between them, heavy and unfiltered. Ethan didn't mean it cruelly, not consciously, but the tone carried the arrogance of someone who'd never watched time steal anything important. Arthur didn't react at first. He set his mug down, the sound deliberate. Then his eyes lifted, catching Ethan's squarely. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "But even if I do, it'll outlast the people who laughed at it." Ethan shifted in his seat, glancing away toward the cluttered table. "You still working on all your little projects?" he asked, trying to soften the moment. Arthur didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the table, where a faded tablecloth covered a long, rectangular shape, something deliberately hidden. He reached for the coffee pot, refilled his mug, then changed the subject. "How's that business of yours going? The startup?" Ethan's confidence flickered briefly. "It's going. We had a couple investors pull back, but it's normal. You know how business works." Arthur nodded slowly. "I used to build bridges, Ethan. When one piece failed, you rebuilt stronger. I hope your kind of building works the same way." Ethan gave a quick smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not really the same thing." He finished his coffee in 2 gulps, glancing at his phone as if the signal would save him from discomfort. Arthur leaned back in his chair, watching the young man who carried his name but not his patience. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." Ethan stood. "Anyway, I just wanted to see how you're doing. Maybe talk about something later." He hesitated. "You know, business stuff." Arthur nodded. "You can always ask. Whether you'll like the answer is another matter." Ethan laughed lightly, missing the undertone. He set the empty mug down, checked his reflection in the window, and turned toward the door. Arthur waited until he heard the crunch of gravel fade down the driveway. Only then did he lift the edge of the tablecloth, revealing the hidden blueprints beneath, precise lines and measurements, sketches of structures tucked between lake and forest. The ink was fresh, the vision intact. He ran a finger over the plans, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he lowered the cloth again. Outside, the sound of Ethan's engine vanished into the distance. Arthur whispered into the quiet, "Not finished yet." Rain streaked the glass walls of the cafe where Ethan sat, his phone pressed against his ear, the brightness of his earlier confidence now dimmed by panic. "I understand," he said tightly, trying to sound calm. "We can pivot. We just need another month." He paused, listening as the investor on the other end spoke bluntly. "No extension, no second chances." His expression cracked. "Right," he muttered. "I appreciate your honesty." The call ended. He stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it down beside his untouched espresso. The app notifications that once flooded him with validation now felt like taunts. Emails labeled withdrawn, terminated, insufficient collateral. His dream startup, the one he'd bragged about for months, was collapsing faster than he could tweet. By the time he reached his mother's house that evening, his usual charm was gone. "Mom, I need to talk to Grandpa," he said the moment Sarah opened the door. Sarah's heart sank. "Ethan, what's happened?" "Nothing's happened," he snapped, pacing. "I just need a bridge loan, 250,000 tops. We're between rounds. Once the new investors come in, I'll pay him back with interest." Sarah hesitated. "You haven't spoken to him properly in years, and now you want—" "It's a loan, Mom. He's sitting on property, assets. He won't even notice it's gone." She sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from recognizing a mistake too late. "Just be respectful this time." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Of course." That night, the rain followed him up the road to Arthur's cabin. When he arrived, the old man was in his workshop, hands steady as he sanded the edge of a wooden frame. "Evening," Arthur said without looking up. "Hey, Grandpa." Ethan stepped inside, glancing at the rough boards and half-finished shelves. "Still working on this place?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Keeps me honest." Ethan got to the point. "Look, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. My company's in a temporary crunch. I just need a bridge loan, say 250. You'll get it back in less than 6 months." Arthur set down his sandpaper and wiped his hands on a rag. His movements were slow, deliberate. 250,000, he repeated as though tasting the number. "Yeah," Ethan said quickly. "You've got the land, the investments. It's nothing for you. I'm not asking for charity." Arthur poured 2 cups of black coffee, placed one in front of his grandson, and sat across from him. "Ethan, do you know what a bridge was before people started using it as a business metaphor?" Ethan frowned. "A bridge?" Arthur nodded. "It carried weight, but only if it was built strong enough. Otherwise, it collapsed under the first fool who tried to cross it." Ethan leaned back, exasperated. "Come on, Grandpa, this isn't a lesson. I'm asking for help." Arthur's gaze stayed steady. "I am helping. I'm suggesting you learn sustainability before you build anything else." Ethan laughed, harsh, incredulous. "So, that's it? You're a stingy old man clinging to pennies. You could change my life and you're sitting here talking about bridges." The silence that followed was cold and exact. Arthur didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "My money's not the lesson you need." Sarah's voice broke in from the doorway. She had followed Ethan, anxious. "Dad, please, he's under pressure. He didn't mean—" Arthur turned to her, his tone gentler. "I know what he meant." Then back to Ethan. "If you built something that collapses this easily, you built it wrong." Ethan's face flushed. "You know what? Keep your money. You'd rather see me fail than help me." He grabbed his coat, storming past his mother. "Maybe when you're gone, someone practical will decide what to do with this dump." The door slammed. Rain filled the space he'd left. For a long time, no one spoke. Sarah stood there, eyes down, ashamed. "He doesn't understand," she whispered. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. "He will." From the shadowed porch, another figure watched. Lydia Rhodes, her umbrella folded, her expression thoughtful. She had come by to drop off documents, but stayed when she heard raised voices. As Ethan's car tore down the driveway, she stepped inside. "You knew he'd ask." Arthur gave a slow nod. Every man asks when he's drowning. Lydia studied him, her tone softer now. And you're already building the raft. Arthur didn't answer. He looked toward the table in the corner, where rolled blueprints rested beneath a heavy book. His fingers brushed the edge of the cover, the ledger of respect. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, low and patient. Lydia followed his gaze, realization dawning in her eyes. You've already started, haven't you? Arthur smiled faintly. Not yet, he said. But soon. The rumor began as carelessly as most lies do, in the echo chamber of ego and pity. A week after Arthur's refusal, Ethan sat in a downtown bar with his usual circle, pretending the laughter around him didn't sting. The bartender knew him by name, but not by substance. So the old man finally cut you off? One friend joked, sipping his drink. Ethan forced a smirk. Cut me off? Please. He's got nothing left to cut. The words came easier than the truth. The land, the cabin. He's basically bankrupt, Ethan continued. It's all rotting up there. He's too proud to admit it, but Mom and I might have to take over soon before the bank does. His friends exchanged surprised glances, some sympathetic, some opportunistic. And just like that, the story grew legs. Within days, it left Portland, hit social media, then drifted east into the quiet folds of the Oregon countryside where Arthur lived. At the local diner in Mitchell Creek, two men whispered over coffee. You hear about old Arthur Mitchell? Went bust, I heard. Can't keep up his property. The waitress shook her head, half believing, half curious. Gossip in small towns is like wildfire, harmless at first until it finds something dry enough to burn. By the end of the week, everyone knew. The man who'd once built bridges across the state was now supposedly too broke to fix his own roof. Tom Alvarez, Arthur's caretaker, heard it first from the hardware store clerk. He drove straight to the cabin, boots still dusted with sawdust, his jaw tight. Arthur, he said, stepping into the porch where the old man was oiling his tools. You seen what they're saying about you? Arthur didn't look up. I have, Tom frowned. It's your grandson spreading it. Folks in town think you lost everything. Want me to set it straight? Arthur's hand paused on the rag, then continued its steady motion. No. Tom blinked. No? He's dragging your name through mud, sir. Arthur looked up then, his gaze calm, but edged with quiet authority. Let him underestimate me, Tom. It's easier to build while unseen. Tom hesitated, studying the older man's expression. There was no anger there, only the precise focus of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning insult into blueprint. He finally nodded. Whatever you say, boss. When Tom left, the property fell silent again, broken only by the sound of distant rain tapping the tin roof. Arthur walked down the narrow corridor to his study, past old photos and engineering awards that no longer mattered to anyone but him. He stopped at the bookshelf, pressed his hand against a wooden panel, and heard the soft mechanical click beneath his palm. A section of the floor eased open, the vault. A cool draft rose from below as he descended the steps into a room hidden beneath the cabin. The walls were lined with metal shelves, neat as a museum, rolled blueprints, deed boxes, thick envelopes stamped with state seals. On a central table sat a safe, its steel door slightly ajar. Inside were gold certificates, old war bonds, and signed property transfers that dated back decades. Wealth not flaunted, but preserved. Arthur reached for one of the rolled plans and unspooled it. A detailed sketch of a lakeside expansion. Solar panels, water turbines, modular cabins tucked into the forest canopy. It wasn't a dream. It was design. He studied it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew that true power came from preparation, not performance. Upstairs, a knock echoed faintly. Lydia's voice called down. Arthur, I brought the papers. He climbed the stairs, closing the vault with a firm click. In here, he said. Lydia entered, her expression sharp but concerned. Tom told me about the rumor. You're sure you don't want to address it? Arthur smiled slightly. If people believe I'm poor, they'll stop watching. That's when the real work gets done. She set her briefcase on the table and opened a folder. Then let's make sure your nothing is protected. I've updated the trusts and the land filings. Quietly, of course. Arthur signed without hesitation. Good. Quiet suits me. When she looked up, she found him gazing out the window toward the line of trees where the lake waited beyond. The last light of day painted his reflection in the glass, not the image of a broken man, but of one rebuilding something far greater than fortune. Lydia, he said softly. Yes? Let's finish the cabin. She closed the folder slowly, sensing the shift in his tone. Not nostalgia, but intention. All right, she said. Let's. Outside, the sky turned copper as the sun slipped behind the pines. Inside, Arthur's faint smile caught the dying light. A man forgotten by rumor, but quietly sharpening the truth. The phone rang on a quiet Thursday afternoon, slicing through the sound of steady rain against Arthur's cabin roof. He wiped the sawdust from his hands before picking it up. Ethan, he said calmly, his voice carrying that familiar patience that often disarmed anger before it arrived. Grandpa, Ethan replied, wary but curious. Didn't expect to hear from you. Arthur's tone softened, almost casual. I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to show you the place one last time, before I sell it. A pause crackled across the line. Ethan sat up straighter in his downtown apartment, glancing out at the city skyline. Sell it? You mean the cabin? You're serious. Arthur chuckled quietly. 72 years old, son. Even stubborn men know when to start closing chapters. Ethan's pulse quickened. Sell it. The words sparked with possibility. Land meant money. Property meant inheritance. I'd love to come by, he said quickly, trying to keep his tone even. Next weekend works. I can drive up. Good, Arthur said. Let's keep it just between us, you and me. There's something I want you to see, and lessons work better one student at a time. Ethan laughed politely, though he didn't quite understand what that meant. Sure thing, Grandpa. Just us. When he hung up, the city lights seemed to burn a little brighter. He poured himself a drink, leaned back in his chair, and imagined the real estate listings already. Finally giving up the land, he muttered to himself, a grin forming. Within an hour, his friends knew the news. Grandpa's cashing out. He even shared a group chat message. Guess the old man's ready to retire for real. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the message Ethan forwarded her. Come visit next weekend. I want to show you the place before I sell it. Her chest tightened with unease. She called her father immediately. Dad, you invited him up? Alone? Arthur's voice was steady. Yes. You know how he gets when money's involved, she said. He's convinced you owe him something. I should come. Make sure he doesn't... Arthur interrupted gently, his tone firm but kind. Sarah, this visit isn't about money. It's about what he's forgotten, and you can't teach two people the same lesson at once. She sighed. What lesson is that? Arthur smiled faintly into the receiver. Respect. There was a long silence before she finally exhaled. Be careful, Dad. I always am, he said softly. When the call ended, Arthur stood at the window, watching the rain ease into mist. The forest beyond glistened, every pine glistening under faint sunlight. Behind him, Lydia Rhodes entered without knocking, her presence as steady as the ticking clock on the mantel. He took the bait? She asked, setting a folder on the table. Arthur gave a slow nod. He's coming next weekend. Lydia opened the folder, documents, maps, financial records, everything ready. You really think he'll understand what you're doing? Arthur turned from the window. Understanding isn't the goal, Lydia. Seeing is. For the next few days, the property transformed under quiet hands. Tom Alvarez worked from dawn till dusk, trimming, repairing, polishing. His movements precise but unhurried. Beneath the rustic wood and stone, the estate's hidden systems came alive. Solar arrays humming silently behind tree lines, geothermal vents disguised beneath wild grass, pathways of smooth glass sealed under cedar planks. What looked like an aging cabin from the outside pulsed with quiet brilliance beneath. Tom wiped sweat from his brow. You sure you want him to see all this, Arthur? Arthur smiled faintly. He's seen what failure looks like. Now he'll see what patience builds. By Friday night, the work was done. The cabin looked unchanged, humble, time-worn. Yet something in the air around it hummed differently, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Back in Portland, Ethan stood before his mirror, adjusting his designer jacket. Grandpa's finally giving up his land, he said to his reflection, grinning. Guess the old man's ready to make things right. His friends wished him luck, some even joking about claiming inheritance early. Ethan just laughed. In the cabin, Arthur sat at his desk beneath the soft glow of a lamp. The room was filled with the scent of pine oil and fresh paper. He opened a small leather-bound notebook and wrote slowly, carefully, each word deliberate, the ledger of respect. On the first blank line, he penned a name, Ethan Mitchell. Then, beneath it, a single note, lesson begins. He set the pen down, closed the book, and exhaled quietly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a low, steady whisper carrying toward the lake. Arthur glanced once more at the dark window, his reflection clear and calm. Next weekend, he murmured, a trace of resolve in his voice. We start next weekend. The road narrowed as Ethan's car climbed through the mountains, the air growing thinner with every curve. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, and his phone screen now glared a taunting, no service. He tossed it onto the passenger seat, muttering under his breath, Who lives this far off the grid? The irony escaped him. A man running a tech startup, now stranded in silence, unable to refresh a single feed. The deeper he drove, the quieter it became. The forest closed in on both sides, pine trees swaying against the wind like an audience watching him pass. Every mile marker looked older, every sign more faded. He turned the music up just to fill the emptiness, but even the bass felt swallowed by the woods. By the time the road straightened out, frustration had settled into unease. Then he saw it. The familiar outline of an old red pickup parked beside a simple wooden gate. The paint had dulled, the chrome worn thin by weather, yet it stood there like an old soldier refusing to surrender. A carved sign hung above the gate, its edges softened by years of rain and snow, Mitchell Creek Cabin. Ethan slowed the car to a stop. He stared at the sign for a moment, exhaling through a tight jaw. This is it, he muttered. He half expected something grander, something that hinted at the inheritance he imagined was waiting. Instead, he found modesty, wood, stone, and the quiet hum of unseen life beyond the trees. As he stepped out, gravel crunching beneath polished shoes, the front door creaked open. Arthur appeared, framed by sunlight breaking through the clouds. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, and his hands carried the same calm authority they always had. Morning, Arthur said, voice warm and grounded. You made it. Ethan forced a smile. Barely. You know there's zero signal up here. I thought Oregon had Wi-Fi everywhere. Arthur chuckled softly. Some places are meant to stay quiet. He gestured toward the porch. Coffee? Ethan hesitated, then followed. The steps groaned under his weight, and he noticed the details, the way each board was fitted cleanly, the grain polished smooth. The place might have looked old, but it didn't feel neglected. It felt intentional. On the porch, Arthur poured coffee from an old steel pot into two mismatched mugs, one with a chipped rim, the other with faded lettering that once spelled Bend Hardware 1984. Ethan took his cup reluctantly, glancing around at the rough logs and the handmade railings. So, this is the famous cabin, he said, half joking, half skeptical. Looks more like a hunting shack than a retirement home. Arthur smiled faintly, eyes glinting behind the steam of his coffee. Some cabins hold more than walls. Ethan raised a brow. What's that supposed to mean? Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he stepped off the porch and nodded toward the surrounding trees. Take a walk with me. They moved along a narrow trail that curved behind the cabin. The air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Ethan followed reluctantly, careful not to dirty his shoes. As they turned the corner, the view opened, and for the first time, Ethan's confidence faltered. Behind the cabin, hidden by the dense tree line, was A clearing lined with long rows of glass, sleek solar panels angled perfectly toward the sky. Beneath them, a network of pipes disappeared underground, the faint hum of machinery blending with the whisper of the forest. It was like stumbling into a secret world, old craftsmanship meeting modern genius. Ethan stopped walking. You built all this? Arthur's eyes stayed on the panels, the sunlight flashing across them like quiet applause. Piece by piece, he said, you'd be surprised what patience can power. Ethan looked back toward the cabin, suddenly seeing it differently. The rough wood exterior, the hand-cut beams, even the aged truck now seemed deliberate, a disguise. Arthur turned to him. You judged the cover before reading the story. Happens a lot these days. Ethan forced a laugh, trying to recover. Guess you're more off-grid than I thought. Arthur smiled again, polite, distant, unreadable. Off-grid doesn't mean out of reach. They stood there for a moment, wind moving through the trees, the hum of hidden energy pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Ethan took another sip of coffee, his arrogance cooling into curiosity. He looked at his grandfather, wondering, for the first time in years, if he'd ever really known the man at all. Arthur glanced toward the horizon, where the clouds were breaking over the mountain ridge. Come on, he said quietly. You haven't seen the inside yet. Ethan followed, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by something closer to unease, though he couldn't say why. As the two figures disappeared through the cabin door, the camera might have lingered, sweeping over the quiet grandeur of the land, the glinting panels half buried in forest shadow. A humble place, yes, but pulsing with hidden power. Inside, the faint sound of hinges creaked, and then the door shut softly behind them. Ethan followed his grandfather through the cabin door, expecting the scent of old wood and forgotten years, the stale musk of a place long past its prime. Instead, he stopped dead just a few steps inside. There was no dust, no clutter, no sagging furniture. The air was clean and cool, touched with the faint hum of hidden systems. The interior was unlike anything he had imagined. From the outside, it was a rustic lodge. Inside, it was a quiet marvel, a symphony of craft and technology. The walls, though paneled in cedar, curved with the precision of engineered design. Light filtered through thin skylines hidden between beams, creating the illusion of perpetual dawn. Beneath his feet, glass panels revealed a shallow stream running directly under the cabin, the water gliding over smooth stones and catching the reflection of the ceiling lights above. It wasn't decoration, it was engineering disguised as art. Ethan's eyes widened. What is this place? His voice echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the open design. Arthur moved deeper, inside, his hand brushing across the wooden counter. A cabin, he said simply. Ethan gave a soft laugh, the kind that didn't quite fit his unease. This isn't a cabin. This is... He stopped mid-sentence, noticing the touch screen seamlessly embedded into the walls, the faint shimmer of motion sensors, adjusting the light as they walked. Arthur smiled, reading his thoughts. It's still a cabin, just one that listens. Ethan turned slowly, taking it in. The sleek glass, the minimal furniture, the quiet hum beneath every surface. You built this? With my hands, Arthur said, after retirement. Took about 10 years. Ethan stared at him, trying to fit that sentence into reality. You built this alone? Arthur shrugged lightly. Tom helped with the groundwork, but most of it, yeah. Ethan's eyes darted from wall to ceiling, trying to calculate. This must have cost, what, millions? The solar array, the materials, the automation alone? Arthur cut him off gently, still smiling. Cost me patience. The words landed with weight. Ethan blinked, unsure if it was humility or quiet defiance. Patience. Arthur poured him a glass of water from a faucet that glowed faintly as it detected motion. I had plenty of time after your grandmother passed, he said. Building this place gave me something to do with the silence. Ethan accepted the glass, but didn't drink. So, you spent 10 years out here, building a hidden mansion under everyone's nose. Arthur chuckled. I wasn't hiding it. I just wasn't advertising it. He gestured toward the window, where the trees swayed beyond. The world doesn't listen much anymore. I figured I'd build something that would. Ethan frowned, half laughing. You mean this whole EcoSmart paradise is a metaphor? Arthur met his gaze. You could call it that, or you could call it work done right. They stood in the center of the room, generations facing each other, the hum of technology surrounding them like a low heartbeat. Ethan ran his hand along the smooth surface of the table, tracing the grain with his fingertip. The material felt warm, alive. This is... He hesitated. I didn't think you had the money for something like this. Arthur's eyes glinted just faintly. That's the problem. You think money builds things. Ethan looked away, embarrassed, trying to cover his discomfort with a smirk. You have to admit, Grandpa, this isn't normal. You're living in a literal prototype for a luxury off-grid home, and you've been pretending to be broke. Arthur took a sip of his own water. I never pretended. People just believed what they wanted to believe. The quiet between them thickened. Ethan exhaled, the bravado slipping. You could have told me. Arthur's expression softened. Not pity, not anger, something deeper. You weren't ready to listen. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The faint murmur of the stream beneath their feet filled the silence. Somewhere in the distance, wind rustled the pines, carrying with it the sound of rain that hadn't started yet. Ethan looked back toward the door, the simple exterior beyond it now seeming like a mask. He felt something unfamiliar, not awe exactly, but humility's quieter cousin. Arthur glanced at him, his tone lighter now. Come on, there's more to see. Ethan hesitated, still trying to process the contrast between what he'd mocked and what he'd found. He managed a small, awkward laugh. I don't even know what to call this place anymore. Arthur's answer came steady and simple. Call it what it is, a small cabin. Ethan almost smiled. Small, huh? Arthur looked toward the glowing panels and the steady flow beneath their feet. Size is just what people see first. Meaning takes a little longer. Ethan nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Not yet. The faint hum under the floor deepened, a mechanical whisper blending with the sound of the stream. Arthur's face was calm, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, patient, gave away more than his words ever could. The air seemed to hold its breath again. Whatever this place was, Ethan realized, it wasn't just a home. It was a message. The cabin had already defied everything Ethan expected, but as Arthur moved toward the far corner of the living room, lifting a woven rug with quiet purpose, Ethan felt his stomach twist with a strange anticipation. Beneath the rug, a square outline of metal shimmered faintly under the floor light. Arthur crouched and pressed a hidden latch. A low mechanical click echoed, followed by a sigh of shifting air. What's that? Ethan asked, his voice unsteady. Arthur didn't answer right away. He lifted the panel effortlessly, revealing a steel hatch with a recessed handle. Come see, he said simply. Then, with surprising strength for his age, he swung it open. A cool draft rose from below, crisp, filtered, impossibly clean. A staircase descended into soft light. Ethan hesitated at the edge. You have a basement? Arthur smiled faintly. Something like that. He started down the steps, his hand gliding along the rail. Ethan followed, his polished shoes clicking against the metal rungs, his curiosity overriding the discomfort that had begun to replace arrogance. At the bottom, the air was different, steady, humming, alive, with quiet machinery. The underground chamber opened wide, much larger than the cabin above could possibly suggest. The walls were smooth concrete, lined with stainless steel shelving. The temperature was constant, the lighting soft, but exact. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes struggling to take it in. On one side sat a row of restored classic cars, polished, immaculate, each one gleaming under narrow beams of light. A '67 Mustang, a Chevy Bel Air, even an old Land Rover that looked ready to drive into another century. Beside them, a glass wall revealed humming turbines, the faint trickle of water spinning through hydro-powered generators that glowed with subtle blue light. On the back wall, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Binders, rolled blueprints, and dozens of framed documents stamped with government seals. Patents, dozens of them. Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke. You own all this? Arthur's answer came without hesitation. Owned, past tense. Ethan turned toward him, confused. What do you mean? Arthur stepped forward, running his hand along one of the turbines. These machines started the early prototypes for the Mitchell Green initiative. I designed them years ago, before anyone cared about renewable systems. He looked up, the light glinting against his glasses. When the companies took off, I sold the patents. Cheaply, some would say, but it gave others the chance to build something larger than I ever could. Ethan's throat went dry. So, all those energy startups, they were yours? Arthur gave a small, tired smile. Not mine anymore. I built them so others could own them. Ethan stared around, mind spinning. Every preconception he'd carried, the jokes, the assumptions, the smug dismissal, all of it crumbled in the silence of that room. The broke old man had been quietly shaping the future while he was busy chasing trends and validation. But why? He asked finally, almost a whisper. Why hide it? Why let everyone think you had nothing? Arthur turned to face him fully, his expression calm but sharp. Because people respect mystery longer than they respect money. The minute you tell them what you're worth, they stop seeing your work and start counting your pockets. Ethan had no answer. The words echoed against the metal walls, heavy with truth. He looked at his grandfather, this quiet builder who had lived without applause, who had measured his worth in blueprints instead of followers. And something inside him faltered. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small, not belittled, but exposed. His chest tightened with a weight he couldn't name. Not guilt yet, but the slow beginning of it. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle yet grounding. There's a difference between wealth and worth, Ethan. One ends when the market shifts. The other outlasts the man who built it. Ethan looked around again. The turbines, the shelves of history, the quiet power that pulsed through the air, and found no words. His reflection in the polished car window looked different now, smaller, less certain. Arthur turned back toward the stairs, speaking over his shoulder. Come on, there's still more to see. Ethan followed, his footsteps slower this time, his earlier bravado left somewhere in the shadows below. As the hatch closed above them, the camera might have lingered on the vault's faint light, a quiet world of legacy, hidden under a humble roof. And in that silence, the first crack appeared in Ethan's pride. Rain had started early that afternoon, the soft kind that whispered against the cabin roof instead of pounding it. Inside, Arthur and Ethan sat across from each other at the long oak table. Between them, steam rose from a pot of stew, the air thick with the scent of herbs and slow-cooked vegetables. Tom Alvarez moved quietly in the background, setting down plates without interrupting. It was the kind of meal built on patience. Everything in Arthur's world seemed to be. Arthur ladled stew into Ethan's bowl. You'll want to eat while it's warm, he said. Ethan gave a polite nod, but stirred it absent-mindedly, still half distracted by what he'd seen downstairs. The turbines, the patents, the quiet brilliance of it all still gnawed at him. You really built all that on your own, he said finally. The turbines, the solar systems, everything. Arthur smiled faintly. Not on my own. I had help when I needed it. But mostly it was just work. The kind that takes more time than money. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. You make it sound easy. It wasn't, Arthur said softly. But it was honest. That word, honest, hung between them. The storm outside deepened, wind pressing against the cabin windows. Arthur continued, his voice steady. See, real craftsmanship isn't just about building something that lasts. It's about building something that means something. A man should be able to point to his work and say, that's mine, not because he bought it, but because he earned it. Ethan gave a short laugh. So what, you're saying I should quit and build birdhouses? Arthur's eyes lifted slowly, patient but firm. I'm saying you can't sell foundations. Ethan frowned. Foundations? Arthur gestured toward the beams above them, the ones holding the cabin steady. The most important parts of what we build aren't the ones people see. You can market a product, Ethan, but you can't market integrity. Once you trade that for applause, you're just performing, not building. Ethan gave another forced laugh, but his voice cracked slightly. You sound like one of those motivational podcasts. Arthur smiled. Difference is, I don't charge for advice. The remark wasn't meant to sting, but it landed that way. Ethan's smirk faltered, his spoon clinking against the bowl. For a moment, the sound of the rain filled the silence. Then he looked up, meeting his grandfather's gaze. You think I'm just chasing money, don't you? Arthur didn't answer right away. His expression softened, not judgmental, just quietly sad. I think you've mistaken noise for progress. Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. You have no idea what it's like now. Everything moves fast. If you don't grab what's in front of you, someone else will. It's survival. Arthur nodded. Maybe, but what's the point of surviving if you don't stand for anything while you do it? Ethan's reply caught in his throat. He picked up his spoon again, but didn't eat. The stew had gone cold. Tom, standing by the counter, watched quietly, pretending to busy himself with dishes. He'd worked for Arthur long enough to recognize this rhythm, the steady chiseling of words, the kind that didn't break through right away but left an impression over time. Arthur's gaze lingered on his grandson, not angry, not disappointed, but heavy with a sadness that seemed older than the walls around them. You've got the mind for building, Ethan, he said finally. You just haven't learned what to build yet. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a laugh that didn't sound like one. Guess I'll add that to my list of life lessons. Arthur didn't smile this time. He only nodded. Good place to start. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley, a slow, distant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, as if the mountain itself was exhaling. Tom glanced toward the window, then back to the table where the two men sat in the dim light. The air had changed, heavy, charged, as though the storm outside had found its echo inside the cabin. Arthur reached for his mug, taking a slow sip of coffee gone bitter. Storm's coming, he murmured. Ethan looked up, unsure if he meant the weather or something else entirely. The lights flickered once, briefly like a heartbeat, before steadying again. Night fell heavy over the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the forest slick with rain and silence. The hum of the generators below had quieted to a distant whisper, and Arthur had long since gone to bed. But Ethan couldn't sleep. His thoughts raced like static, images of the vault, the turbines, the patents, all swirling with one burning question. Why hide it all from me? The floorboards creaked under his steps as he wandered through the main room. The cabin, in its silence, felt like it was watching him. His eyes caught on a narrow hallway near the study, a place Arthur hadn't shown him. The door was ajar. Curiosity, sharpened by frustration, pulled him closer. Inside, moonlight filtered through a skylight, illuminating a desk stacked neatly with files and framed documents. The smell of cedar and ink filled the air. Ethan reached out, fingers brushing against the nearest frame. It was a deed, Mitchell Renewable Systems, 1997. He recognized the company name. It was one of the early pioneers in sustainable engineering. Another frame hung beside it, Cascade Energy Holdings, 2003. One after another, every document bore Arthur's name at the bottom, founder and chief engineer, each stamped with transfer seals. But the next item on the desk stopped him cold. A single envelope, unsealed. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. Lydia Rhodes. He hesitated before unfolding the letter inside. In the event of Arthur Mitchell's passing, all property, patents, and assets shall transfer to the Mitchell Green Foundation, a nonprofit trust established for the development of renewable technologies and veterans housing projects. Executor, Lydia Rhodes. Ethan read the paragraph again, slower this time, disbelief turning to dread. His name wasn't there, not once. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air tighter. The foundation, he whispered. A charity. He laughed under his breath, sharp and bitter. You've got to be kidding me. He set the letter down, but his hand trembled as he did. All this time, the land, the machines, the money, and Arthur had built it only to give it away. By dawn, his anger had curdled into something darker. He found Arthur outside on the porch, already awake, sipping coffee as fog drifted across the valley. The old man looked calm, as if he'd been expecting him. Ethan's voice broke the stillness. You'd give strangers what belongs to family. Arthur didn't look surprised. He set his mug down, the sound gentle but final. You've been in my study, he said quietly. I had a right to know, Ethan shot back. You've built all of this, all these years, and you're just going to hand it off to some foundation? To outsiders? Arthur met his grandson's fury with a kind of sorrowful patience. They're not strangers, Ethan. They're people who need what I can leave behind. I've already given family what they needed most. Ethan scoffed. Oh yeah? What's that? Opportunity. The word landed like a challenge. Ethan shook his head, pacing across the porch. You think this is noble? It's stupid. You're erasing your own name. Our name. Arthur stood, slow and deliberate. The morning light caught the edges of his face, carved deep with years of resolve. Names fade, he said. Work doesn't. Family inherits gratitude, not entitlement. For a moment, Ethan just stared at him, chest heaving, eyes burning with disbelief. You actually believe that? Arthur's voice didn't rise. I have to. It's the only way to build something that lasts. Ethan's composure snapped. You're unbelievable. You'll die up here surrounded by strangers and think that's legacy? Arthur didn't flinch. Legacy isn't about who remembers your face, Ethan. It's about who lives better because you were here. The words should have softened him, but they didn't. Ethan turned sharply, his movements stiff, mechanical. Keep your legacy, he spat. You can take it to the grave. He stormed off the porch, gravel crunching beneath his shoes. A moment later, the roar of his car filled the valley, tires spinning as he tore down the drive, flinging dirt and stones into the air. Arthur stood there, unmoving, watching the dust trail disappear into the trees. Tom stepped out from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. You told him? Arthur nodded once. He found out. Tom exhaled. He's angry. Arthur's eyes followed the road where Ethan's car had vanished. His voice was quiet but certain. He's not done yet. Pride never ends that clean. The fog thickened again, wrapping the cabin in a cold, silver hush. Arthur turned back toward the door, the steam from his coffee curling into the air like breath from something still alive. Ethan hadn't slept. The storm that rolled over the mountains the night before had mirrored the one clawing inside him, loud, relentless, full of flashes of anger he couldn't quiet. He paced his apartment like a trapped animal, the letter from Lydia still burned into his mind. Mitchell Green Foundation. Every time he saw those words, his pulse spiked. At sunrise, he called his mother. Mom, he said, voice tight but measured, we need to talk about Grandpa. Sarah's tone was wary, still groggy. Ethan, it's early. What happened? He hesitated just long enough to sound sincere. I think he's losing it. He's talking about giving everything away. The land, the patents, all of it. He's signing things over to a foundation no one's ever heard of. Sarah sat up in bed, the sheets rustling. What are you talking about? He's not well, Ethan pressed. You've seen how isolated he's become. He's not thinking clearly. If we don't step in now, everything he's worked for, everything that should stay in the family, will disappear. On the other end of the line, Sarah went quiet. Her father's stubborn independence had always worried her, but the idea of him losing his mind frightened her more. Ethan, I don't know. Mom, he interrupted gently, his voice softening to mimic concern. We can't just watch him throw it all away. There's got to be a legal way to secure the property until he's stable. Sarah hesitated, torn between fear and guilt. Maybe we should talk to Lydia first. She's been handling his papers for years. Lydia? Ethan's tone snapped. She's part of it. Her name's on the foundation filings. She's enabling him. Before Sarah could respond, another voice entered the call, calm, composed. "Sarah, it's Lydia." Ethan froze. "I'm here," Lydia continued. "I came by this morning. Arthur's fine. He knows what he's doing." Sarah's breath caught. "You're there now?" "Yes," Lydia said gently. "And I'd advise you both not to make any rash moves. What Arthur's doing isn't madness, it's foresight. He's protecting what he's built." Ethan's patience cracked. "You mean protecting it from us?" Lydia's tone sharpened. "From greed, Ethan. Don't confuse the two." He hung up before she could say more, the dial tone buzzing in his ear like static. Rage clouded reason. Within minutes, he was behind the wheel, tires squealing as he shot down the wet mountain road toward the county seat. The drive blurred, gray skies, flashes of lightning far off over the ridges, the world narrowing into a single objective: control. "If the property isn't transferred yet, I can stop it," he told himself. "I can protect what's ours." The county office was nearly empty when he burst in, rain dripping from his jacket. The clerk at the counter, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up over her glasses. "Morning. Can I help you?" "Yes," Ethan said quickly, pulling a folder from his bag. "I need to file a protective claim over my grandfather's property in Mitchell Creek. It's urgent." She typed slowly, the rhythmic clack of keys filling the silence. "Name?" "Arthur Mitchell." Her fingers paused. She glanced up. "Arthur Mitchell, the engineer?" "Yes," he said, impatient. "He's not mentally fit to manage his assets anymore, and there's a fraudulent trust being filed in his name. I'm here to—" Her expression didn't change, but her tone did. "That's already been handled." Ethan blinked. "What?" She turned her monitor slightly toward him. "Arthur Mitchell filed a protective trust 2 years ago. The Mitchell Green Foundation. Everything's already secured, legally airtight." The words hit like a physical blow. He stared at the screen, his own reflection trembling in the glass. 2 years, he whispered. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was very thorough. Lydia Rhodes was the witness on record." Ethan stepped back, the edges of the room tilting. The fight drained from his body, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. His grandfather hadn't been outmaneuvered. He had predicted this. Every step, every argument, even this desperate attempt. He walked out into the rain, the sky darkening above him again. The first flash of lightning split the clouds, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the air itself. He stood beside his car, gripping the door handle, his reflection distorted in the wet glass. For the first time, his anger didn't feel like control. It felt like failure. He slammed the door and sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield as rain pelted the glass in sharp, rhythmic taps. His breath came unevenly. Lightning struck again, this time close, somewhere near the hills where the cabin stood. The flash illuminated the sky in blinding white, then faded into the low rumble of thunder. Ethan flinched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered what he already knew. Arthur had built more than a cabin. He'd built a fortress, not of walls, but of foresight. And Ethan was standing on the outside of it. The rain had turned the mountain roads into glass. Ethan's tires hissed over the slick asphalt, his headlights slicing through fog that clung stubbornly to the trees. The world outside his windshield was a blur of gray and green, a maze of regret and defiance. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to ache. Every thought circled back to his grandfather, the trust, the rejection, the humiliation. The man had outplayed him, outplanned him, but not forever. He rounded a bend too fast. The car fishtailed, tires screaming against the wet gravel. His heart jumped to his throat. He jerked the wheel, overcorrecting, and the vehicle spun, once, twice, before slamming sideways into a shallow ditch. The sound was brutal, metal twisting, glass cracking, the roar of rain swallowing the rest. Then silence. Steam rose from the crumpled hood as rain continued to fall. Ethan groaned, dazed, his shoulder throbbing where the seatbelt had caught him. He tried to move, but pain shot through his leg. The airbag hung deflated, smelling faintly of smoke and dust. In the distance, headlights approached. A familiar old truck came into view, its engine rumbling low. The door opened, and Arthur stepped into the rain, flashlight in hand. Tom Alvarez followed close behind, shouting over the storm. "Ethan," Arthur called. "You all right?" Ethan tried to answer, but his throat felt tight. Arthur waded through the mud and opened the car door, assessing the damage with a calm precision. "You're lucky," he said. "Few more feet and you'd have gone over." Tom leaned in. "We've got him." Together they lifted Ethan out, supporting him between their shoulders. The younger man winced with every step, but didn't resist. The storm had stripped him of fight. Inside the cabin, the fire was already burning. Arthur eased Ethan onto the couch, covering him with a wool blanket. The flickering light painted the room in shades of amber and shadow. "Stay still," Arthur said, his tone even, almost clinical. "No fractures, just bruises. You'll be fine." Ethan stared at the ceiling, chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. His voice came out rough, the words laced with bitterness. "You still think you're better than me?" Arthur paused mid-motion, glancing at him over the firelight. "No," he said quietly. "Just older." The simplicity of it disarmed the tension. Ethan turned his head, watching his grandfather's silhouette, steady, deliberate, as he tended to the fire. The wood cracked, embers rising like tiny sparks of unspoken words. Arthur fetched a basin of water and a cloth, cleaning the small cut on Ethan's temple. His movements were efficient, careful, like a man who'd done this kind of caretaking before. When he was done, he said, "You'll sleep here tonight. Roads are no good until morning." Ethan wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at him. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only soreness and the dull ache of realization. "Why'd you come for me?" he murmured. Arthur's voice softened. "Because family doesn't leave family in a ditch, even when they've lost their way." Ethan closed his eyes, the fire's warmth spreading through his chilled body. The storm outside began to settle into a rhythmic drizzle. In the half-dreaming space between waking and sleep, he heard something faint. A hammer striking wood, slow and steady. He opened one eye, just enough to see Arthur at the edge of the porch through the window, repairing a broken beam. Rain fell around him, but he didn't stop. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the cabin like a heartbeat. Ethan's thoughts blurred. Frustration, admiration, confusion, until sleep finally took him. When morning came, the world was washed clean. Mist clung to the trees, the air crisp and cold. The smell of coffee filled the cabin. Ethan stirred, disoriented but alive. The front door creaked open, and Lydia Rhodes stepped in, her coat damp from travel. She looked at Arthur first, then at Ethan, assessing the scene with the quiet intuition of someone who already knew the story. "He's lucky," she said. Arthur nodded. "Luck's just the name we give to lessons that don't kill us." Ethan tried to sit up, wincing as the blanket fell from his shoulders. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Lydia offered him a small, knowing smile. "You will be. Eventually." Arthur handed her a cup of coffee. "He saw the edge," he said. "Now, maybe he'll see the ground." Lydia looked between them, the bruised grandson, the calm grandfather, and something unspoken passed between her and Arthur. The time for concealment was ending. Arthur took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down with finality. "It's time," he said quietly. Lydia nodded once. "You're sure?" Arthur glanced toward Ethan, who watched them, through half-lidded eyes, confusion mixing with curiosity. "He deserves to see what comes next," Arthur said. "All of it." Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the eaves. The storm had broken, but its echo lingered, heavy, expectant, like the pause before a revelation. The morning broke clear and cold, sunlight filtering through pine needles still dripping from the night's storm. Mist hovered above the grass, curling like smoke as it burned away under the rising light. Arthur stood outside the cabin, jacket zipped, a thermos in hand. Behind him, the forest stretched wide, silent, expectant. Ethan emerged slowly from the porch, moving stiffly, one hand still rubbing the bruises on his shoulder. His eyes were heavy from a night of restless sleep and heavier thoughts. Arthur didn't look at him right away. Instead, he took a long sip from the thermos, then nodded toward the path leading down the hill. "Walk with me," he said. Ethan hesitated, then followed. They moved in silence for several minutes, boots crunching through the damp soil. The air smelled of pine and renewal, the kind of quiet only found after storms. Ethan glanced sideways at his grandfather, trying to read the stillness in his face. Finally, they reached a clearing. The trees opened to reveal a broad stretch of land, sunlight spilling across open earth. Ethan stopped walking. His eyes widened. In front of them stood rows of cabins, not finished, but close. Their skeletons rose from the ground, framed in clean timber, foundations poured, roofs half-shingled. Construction tools were neatly arranged beside each structure, and a few work lights still glowed under the shadows of tarps. The sound of the nearby stream hummed like background music to the scene. "What is this?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice cutting through the morning calm. Arthur stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. "A veteran's retreat," he said. "My retirement project." Ethan turned to him, searching for sarcasm. "You built all this?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Started it. Others will finish it. It's funded through the Mitchell Renewable Energy grants." Ethan's gaze snapped toward a wooden post near the first cabin. A white sign, hand-painted but neat, read, "Funded by Mitchell Renewable Energy grants." Below it, a smaller line, "For those who served so they can find peace again." He took a slow step forward, scanning the structures. The design, the angles, the layout, it all looked familiar. The same style, the same clean geometry of his grandfather's cabin. Then the realization hit him. The small cabin wasn't just a home. It was a prototype, a model. "You mean," Ethan began, his voice thinning, "you built all this from that?" Arthur nodded once. The cabin was the test, a blueprint for something bigger. Each of these will run off the same self-sustaining systems, hydro, solar, geothermal. Built to last, built to live. Ethan stared at the rows of half-finished cabins, each one more evidence that he had never really known the man standing beside him. "And you didn't tell anyone?" Arthur's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Wasn't for telling, was for doing." Ethan turned to him, frustration rising again, but this time it felt hollow. "You could have partnered with companies, gone public, made millions off this." Arthur cut him off gently. "We measure wealth in roofs raised, not accounts filled." The words hit harder than they should have. Ethan looked down at the ground, the mud soft under his shoes. His voice came out small. "You always talk like everything's a lesson." Arthur's expression softened. "Maybe because I learned too late that legacy isn't built with applause. It's built with roofs that don't leak and lights that stay on." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, filled with understanding Ethan didn't know how to voice. He turned slowly, his gaze drifting across the site. Workers' tools lay neatly stacked beside piles of lumber, ready for the next hands to take over. Each unfinished cabin looked like a promise mid-sentence. Arthur watched him carefully, the faintest trace of sadness behind his calm. He knew what was forming in Ethan's mind, not yet remorse, but its outline. Ethan knelt down, pressing his hand against the fresh foundation of the nearest cabin. The concrete was still smooth, cool to the touch. "You did all this quietly," he said, "all this time, and we thought you were—" He couldn't finish. Arthur completed it for him. "Broke." Ethan let out a shaky breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Yeah." Arthur looked out over the land, the sun brightening behind the tree line. "Let people think what they want. Truth doesn't need to shout." For the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan didn't have an answer. The arrogance that had fueled him all summer seemed to drain into the soil beneath his boots. He straightened slowly, shoulders heavy, eyes low. Arthur rested a hand on his shoulder, not as victory, not as punishment, but as understanding. "You can stay angry," he said softly, "or you can start building." Ethan didn't respond. He just nodded once, the smallest movement, but full of weight. The wind carried through the clearing, rustling the unfinished roofs. The sound was quiet but alive, as though the place itself was breathing. Arthur turned toward the trail. "Come on," he said. "There's something else you should see." Ethan lingered for a moment longer, staring at the cabins gleaming in the early sun, monuments to patience he'd never respected. When he finally followed, his head was bowed, the pride in his posture replaced by something heavier and more human. The storm had passed, but the reckoning had only begun. The air inside the workshop carried the scent of oil, sawdust, and history. Light spilled. Through the narrow windows, dust motes floating like slow sparks in the air. Ethan followed Arthur wordlessly, still processing the sight of the cabins they had just walked through. Every step echoed louder than it should have. The silence between them was no longer angry. It was cautious, fragile. Arthur stopped near the far wall, where an old drafting table stood covered in blueprints. He moved one of the rolls aside, then pressed his palm against the paneling behind it. A faint click sounded, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan blinked as a section of the wall shifted open, revealing a vault door embedded in the concrete. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan muttered. Arthur smiled slightly, entering a code on the keypad with slow precision. "Every builder keeps his foundations somewhere safe," he said. The mechanism unlocked with a deep metallic thud. When the door swung open, the air that escaped was cool and still, preserved like a moment in time. Inside, the space was modest, not a room of gold or jewels, but of order and meaning. Metal shelves lined the walls, each filled with thick binders, old photographs, sealed envelopes, and neatly labeled boxes. At the center sat a single wooden table. Upon it lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Ethan approached carefully. "What is this?" Arthur ran his fingers along the spine, brushing away a thin layer of dust. "My record," he said softly, "of people who helped and people who forgot." The title was embossed in faint gold, "The Ledger of Respect." Ethan hesitated, then opened it. The first pages were filled with names, handwritten, meticulous. Many were marked with small notes in the margins. Tom Alvarez, loyalty beyond wages. Lydia Rhodes, kept every promise. Marianne Mitchell, my compass. But as he flipped further, the ink changed. Names were crossed out, entire sections blotted with deliberate lines. Sarah Mitchell, forgave too easily. Ethan Mitchell, still learning. Ethan froze. His name sat there, half-crossed, half-finished. He swallowed. "So I'm on the wrong side?" Arthur didn't move closer. "That's up to you," he said simply. Ethan looked back at the book, the quiet weight of it pressing harder than any accusation. Every page told a story of loyalty or betrayal, of those who had shown up when it mattered and those who hadn't. It wasn't a ledger of wealth. It was one of character. He turned another page and saw something unexpected. A list of employees, laborers, and engineers, each one thanked for their contribution. Bonuses paid. Families helped. No mention of profit. No self-congratulation. Just acknowledgement. Arthur's voice broke the silence. "People remember being seen more than being paid. That's something money can't teach." Ethan nodded slowly, the truth of it sinking into places pride had once filled. His throat tightened. "You kept track of everyone." "Everyone who mattered," Arthur said. He reached into a drawer on the table and pulled out a blank page, the edges clean and crisp. He placed it gently on top of the ledger. "You can't erase what's written, Ethan, but you can add to it." Ethan looked down at the empty page, the meaning dawning slowly. "What do you want me to write?" Arthur met his gaze, steady, kind, unwavering. "Something worth reading." The simplicity of the request struck harder than any speech could have. Ethan's chest tightened, shame burned, but behind it was something new, a flicker of possibility. He stared at the blank paper, seeing not judgment, but invitation. Arthur stepped back, giving him space. "The thing about ledgers," he said, "is they're only finished when the writer stops learning." Ethan ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the page, his reflection faint in its whiteness. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. He closed the book gently and looked at his grandfather, voice quiet but steady. Maybe it's time I start building something real. Arthur nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. Then start with yourself. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, rolling across the mountains. Not the sound of another storm, but of something larger shifting. Ethan turned toward the door, the weight of the ledger still lingering in his hands. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like groundwork. 2 weeks later, the silence of Mitchell Creek was broken by the hum of attention. It started small, a photo posted by a visiting surveyor, a brief mention in a sustainability blog. But within days, it spread. The internet had found Arthur Mitchell. The story ran with the kind of headline that caught fire online. The mystery cabins in Oregon, a 72-year-old retiree's design, is redefining sustainable living. The article painted Arthur as an accidental visionary, a man who had quietly built a network of energy-efficient cabins using solar, hydro, and reclaimed materials, a model now studied by universities and nonprofits alike. By the weekend, local news vans rolled into town. Reporters gathered near the trail entrance, cameras aimed toward the tree line as if the forest itself might give them an interview. The story was everywhere: social feeds, podcasts, even business channels debating whether the Mitchell model could become the next great leap in off-grid development. Tom Alvarez tried to keep them off the property, but someone had already captured the image that would define the story: Arthur standing beside one of the nearly finished cabins, his weathered hands on the railing, the sunlight cutting through the pines behind him. Tom was beside him, holding blueprints, both men unaware of the camera. The photograph was honest, unposed. It went viral within hours. Ethan saw it first while scrolling through his phone one morning. He was sitting in his apartment, blinds half drawn, the glow of the screen reflecting off his face. Article after article praised his grandfather, a modern Thoreau, the quiet genius of Oregon's hidden architect. Comment sections overflowed with admiration. This man is a legend. Proof that wisdom doesn't retire. Imagine being this guy's grandson. What a legacy. Ethan's stomach turned at that last line. He set the phone down, staring at nothing for a moment. Pride and shame twisted together in ways he couldn't untangle. For once, the noise of the internet wasn't his, and it wasn't cruel, but it was a mirror he didn't want to face. The phone rang, jarring him back to reality. It was his mother. "Have you seen it?" Sarah asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and emotion. "He's everywhere, Ethan. Your grandfather's on the front page of the Oregon Chronicle. They're calling him a hero." Ethan rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, I saw." There was a pause, the kind filled with words that never came easy between them. Then Sarah sighed. "You know, he's embarrassed us and inspired everyone else." Ethan frowned. "Embarrassed us? You know what I mean," she said softly. "He made us look small without ever meaning to. I used to wish he'd slow down, settle, be normal. But maybe he was right not to." Before Ethan could reply, a faint laugh echoed through the line. His grandfather's voice, warm and distant in the background. "Good blueprints do both," Arthur said, clearly overhearing. Sarah chuckled despite herself. "He's impossible." "He's consistent," came Lydia's voice next. She must have been there too. "That's rarer." Arthur took the phone. "Ethan," he said, his tone measured but not cold. "I'm guessing you've seen what all the noise is about." "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "You're famous now." Arthur laughed, a dry, easy sound. "Fame's just noise that fades. The work's what stays." Ethan hesitated, unsure what to say. Arthur didn't press. He never did. In the background, Lydia spoke softly. "Maybe let him redeem himself through work, Arthur, if he's ready." Arthur's gaze shifted toward the window, watching the cabin roofs gleam under the afternoon light. "Redemption's not a gift," he murmured. "It's labor." There was a beat of silence before Ethan spoke again. "So, what now?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He looked out at the rows of cabins, the hammers, the sawdust, the blueprints unrolled across the tables. "Now," he said finally, Now we build something that lasts longer than pride. Ethan exhaled, his grip on the phone easing. For the first time, he didn't feel defensive, just quiet, thoughtful. As the call ended, the screen dimmed, showing his reflection, the faint resemblance to the man he'd spent so long misunderstanding. Outside, thunder rumbled again in the far distance. Not a storm this time, but a reminder. Something was shifting. Back at the cabin, Arthur poured another cup of coffee. Lydia stood beside him, eyes soft. "You think he'll come?" she asked. Arthur smiled, faint but sure. "He will, when he's ready to work." The morning after the news broke, the air around Mitchell Creek felt charged with something new. Not fame, not quite, but acknowledgement. Reporters had gone, leaving muddy tracks and unanswered emails, but the land itself seemed alive again, buzzing with the quiet rhythm of progress. Arthur stood near the edge of the clearing, clipboard in hand, surveying a new foundation. He looked at the beams stacked neatly nearby, then toward the road winding through the pines. He didn't have to wait long. Ethan's car appeared slowly, dust swirling behind it. He parked a few yards away, stepping out without his usual sharpness. His clothes were simple, clean, not the tailored armor he once wore. He hesitated before approaching, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Arthur turned, meeting his gaze with a calm that didn't need words. "Didn't think I'd see you back so soon," he said. Ethan shrugged, his tone uncertain. "Guess I figured you'd need help with all the attention." Arthur's eyes softened, though his voice stayed measured. "I've had enough help from people who came for attention. What I need is someone who'll build." Ethan looked down, kicking at the dirt with his boot. "After everything I said," Arthur nodded once. "That's why you're needed." The answer caught Ethan off guard. For a moment, he just stood there, trying to find the sarcasm that wasn't coming. But Arthur's expression was steady, free of judgment. The older man handed him a pair of work gloves. "You want to understand this place?" he said. "Start here." They worked in silence at first. Arthur explained how the beams had to be cut to match the grain, not against it. "Wood remembers," he said. "You fight it, it'll split on you." Ethan listened, focusing more than he had in years. His motions were clumsy, uneven, a man trying to fit precision into pride. Tom Alvarez joined them briefly, handing off a new set of tools before heading toward another site. "He's got you working already, huh?" he teased. Ethan smirked faintly. "Guess I earned it." Arthur's response came from behind the sound of a hammer. "Earned or owed, doesn't matter as long as you finish the job." By mid-afternoon, the rhythm had changed. The awkward silence between them gave way to the steady pattern of work. Saw, lift, nail, measure. Sweat replaced hesitation. At one point, Ethan knelt beside the foundation beam, using a level the way Arthur had shown him. "It's crooked," he muttered. Arthur crouched beside him, squinting at the edge. "By a quarter inch. Fixable." Ethan adjusted it, hands trembling slightly, then checked again. "Better?" Arthur nodded. "Better." They moved on to the next task. The cabin was still skeletal. No walls, no roof. But it stood like a promise. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the clearing, long and golden. During a break, Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, looking around. "You built all this by hand?" Arthur leaned against the railing post, the faintest smile crossing his face. "And heart," he said. "That's the part they forget to teach." Ethan nodded slowly, the words settling deep. His voice softened. "I used to think you were wasting time out here. I thought this place was—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Arthur filled the silence gently. "Beneath you." Ethan looked up, ashamed but honest. "Yeah." Arthur studied him. The fatigue. The humility creeping in at the edges. "Funny thing about the ground, Ethan," he said quietly. "You build on it long enough, it becomes home." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to say something. An apology, a confession, anything. But the words tangled behind pride and exhaustion. Instead, he just nodded and picked up the hammer again. They worked until dusk. The sounds of labor, The echo of steel against wood, the murmur of directions, blended into the stillness of evening. For the first time in months, they weren't arguing, competing, or defending. They were building. As they packed up for the night, Arthur handed Ethan a worn notebook, blueprints folded between lined pages. "These are the next designs," he said. "Cabins for the young engineers coming next month. They'll need guidance." Ethan took the notebook carefully, as if holding something more fragile than paper. "You trust me with this?" Arthur's eyes glinted with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't far from it. "Trust isn't given," he said. "It's rebuilt, one beam at a time." The last light of day faded, leaving the valley bathed in twilight. Crickets began to sing. Ethan closed the notebook, tucking it under his arm. He looked at his grandfather, the man he'd mocked, envied, misunderstood, and saw something he hadn't before. Not wealth, not victory, but steadiness. Arthur turned toward the cabin frame, his silhouette framed against the dim sky. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll start on the roof." Ethan nodded, the quiet acceptance in his voice replacing pride. Tomorrow. And for the first time, the word we carried, wait. The Mitchell Green Foundation presentation was scheduled for a gray Tuesday morning in Salem. The conference room smelled faintly of polished oak and coffee, the kind of scent that carried both nerves and negotiation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, where clouds pressed low and heavy, like an audience waiting for the first word. Arthur sat at the head of the table, a small stack of papers before him, his hands folded calmly. Lydia Rhodes stood at his right, elegant and composed as always, the quiet force of organization that kept the entire project breathing. Ethan sat 2 chairs down, trying to appear smaller than he felt. The room was filled with state investors, sustainability directors, and grant officers, people used to seeing polished executives, not an old man in a flannel shirt and work boots. But Arthur didn't play at performance. He never had. Lydia opened the meeting. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice even, deliberate. "Today we're presenting the Mitchell Green Foundation, a veteran housing and renewable energy initiative designed to replicate the prototype system built at Mitchell Creek." She gestured to the projection screen behind her. Photos appeared, the cabins, the solar grids, the hydro turbines, humming quietly beneath pine branches. Every image told a story of work done with precision, not pretense. Arthur stood next, his movement slow but sure. He didn't look at his notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm not here to sell you something new. I'm here to remind you what's possible when you build something right the first time." A few people exchanged glances, the kind that said, "He's not what we expected." Arthur continued anyway. "We've built 14 self-sustaining cabins so far. Each one generates more energy than it uses. We employ veterans, train apprentices, and use reclaimed materials. What we need now isn't money, it's partnership." The simplicity of his words silenced the room. He wasn't pitching, he was inviting. Ethan watched from his seat, hands clasped tight under the table. He'd expected this to go wrong, the older generation lecturing the modern world about values, but it didn't. The investors were listening, really listening. Arthur clicked to the next slide, a diagram of future expansions. Lydia filled in the logistics, projected costs, timelines, environmental impact. Her calm confidence wrapped Arthur's vision in structure, grounding the poetry in numbers. When the presentation ended, a long silence followed, not awkward, but contemplative. Then a man in a gray suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "this is extraordinary. You've achieved in isolation what most labs can't do with a dozen engineers." Arthur gave a modest nod. "Isolation helps you hear what needs fixing." A woman at the far end smiled. "And what happens when you're gone? Who carries this forward?" Ethan froze. All eyes shifted toward Arthur. It was the question Ethan had asked himself weeks ago, the one that had driven him to anger, to panic, to failure. Arthur looked down the table, then toward Ethan. "Someone already is." Ethan blinked. "What?" Arthur motioned for him to stand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is Ethan Mitchell. He'll be heading operations for the expansion phase." The room shifted. Investors straightened, taking in the young man now caught between disbelief and fear. Ethan felt his pulse in his throat. "Grandpa," he began, but Arthur's quiet authority silenced him. "This foundation isn't about inheritance," Arthur said. "It's about endurance. Leadership's not given. It's tested." For a moment, the room was perfectly still. Then Lydia smiled, that subtle, knowing expression of hers that said the lessons landed. She looked from Arthur to Ethan and back, a soft pride glinting behind her professionalism. Ethan swallowed hard, then forced himself to speak. Thank you. I'll do my best." His voice trembled, but it was honest. There was no bravado left in him, no polished facade, just sincerity. Arthur nodded once. "That's all anyone can do. The rest comes after the work." Applause began quietly, then grew, not the thunderous kind reserved for spectacle, but something warmer, more genuine. The investors leaned forward, shaking hands, offering their commitments. The project had earned not just funding, but faith. Lydia leaned toward Arthur. "You just changed his life in front of a room full of strangers." Arthur's gaze stayed on Ethan, who was now surrounded by people asking questions about the designs, his posture unsure but determined. "No," Arthur said quietly. "He'll change it himself. I just gave him a place to start." Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long, pale beams across the table. The foundation was no longer just an idea. It was alive, expanding, multiplying like the morning light itself. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan lingered behind, still processing. Arthur approached, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did fine," he said softly. Ethan looked up, his voice low. "You still trust me after everything?" Arthur smiled faintly. "I trust builders, Ethan. You're learning to be one." The young man nodded, his chest tight with gratitude he couldn't yet voice. As they walked out together, Lydia gathered the final documents. The papers rustled like wind through trees, the sound of something new taking shape. Evening fell like a slow exhale over Mitchell Creek. The last of the day's light stretched across the lake, turning the water to molten amber. A faint chill crept through the pines, but the valley pulsed with quiet life, laughter, footsteps, and the soft hum of new beginnings. The cabins were finished. They stood in 2 neat rows along the shoreline, their wooden exteriors glowing under freshly hung lanterns. Inside, lights flickered on one by one, powered by the same solar grid Arthur had once built with his own hands. Each cabin reflected off the surface of the lake, the ripples carrying their golden shimmer into the darkening woods. Ethan stood near the dock, watching as the first van arrived. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the stillness, and a small group of men and women stepped out. Veterans from across the state, their faces marked by fatigue, resilience, and a quiet kind of hope. Some carried duffel bags, others simply looked around in disbelief, as if unsure the place was really meant for them. Ethan walked forward, hands outstretched. "Welcome," he said, his voice steady but warm. "You'll find your names on the cabin doors. They're ready for you." The men and women nodded, some shaking his hand, some clapping him on the shoulder. One older veteran, his right sleeve pinned where an arm used to be, paused and met Ethan's eyes. "You built this?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "We built this," he said. "My grandfather started it." The man smiled faintly. "Good man, your grandfather. I heard about him." Ethan nodded. "You'll meet him soon." They exchanged a simple handshake. Brief, wordless, the kind that carried more meaning than a dozen speeches. Across the clearing, a small crowd had gathered. Local volunteers, donors, and even a few press representatives watched as the new residents explored their cabins. The doors opened with soft creaks, lights warming every space inside, each one furnished modestly but beautifully. Handmade tables, quilts stitched by locals, shelves stacked with books and framed photographs of Oregon landscapes. It was simple, human, whole. From the hill above, Arthur stood with Lydia and Tom, his figure still and quiet, framed by the twilight. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, his hands resting on the handle of his old walking stick. Below, the valley gleamed like a constellation brought to Earth. "You should be down there," Lydia said, smiling faintly. "They're asking for you." Arthur shook his head. "He's doing fine without me." Lydia followed his gaze to where Ethan was standing, helping a younger veteran lift a crate, laughing softly at something the man said. It wasn't forced. It was honest. "He finally sees," Lydia said, her voice gentle. Arthur's reply came quietly, almost to himself. "No, he finally looks." The difference hung in the air, soft, profound, unspoken. For years, Ethan had seen everything through the lens of comparison, wealth, status, validation. But now, as he moved among the people who would live in the cabins, listening, helping, learning, he wasn't seeing anymore. He was looking. Down below, music began to play from a small speaker someone had brought. An old Frank Sinatra song, faint but steady, its brass notes drifting over the water. The melody was warm, but restrained, the kind that wrapped around the evening rather than interrupted it. The veterans started unpacking, laughter mingling with the rhythm of footsteps on new wooden floors. Tom joined them briefly, showing one of the men how to adjust the heating panels. The lights from each cabin reflected off the lake, trembling slightly with the breeze. It looked like the world was breathing again. Ethan caught sight of his grandfather on the ridge and raised a hand. Not a wave, exactly, but a gesture of acknowledgement. Arthur lifted his walking stick slightly in return. That was enough. For a long while, Arthur said nothing. Lydia stood beside him, arms crossed against the chill, her expression soft. "You know," she said, "most men spend their last years trying to hold on. You let go instead." Arthur smiled faintly. "Letting go's easier when you've built something that can stand without you." The wind stirred the pine needles. A few lights flickered across the cabins as the generators adjusted to the evening load. The scene glowed like memory, warm, fragile, and infinite all at once. Lydia exhaled, watching the reflection of gold shimmer on the lake. "Looks like peace to me." Arthur's gaze stayed on Ethan, now helping hang a flag, beside the first cabin door. "Peace," he murmured, "comes when the next hands take over the work." As night deepened, the cabin's lights grew brighter, casting their glow across the dark water, beacons of something earned, not given. And though no words followed, the moment spoke for itself. Legacy had changed hands. The ballroom glowed under soft amber lights, the kind that made polished wood shine like memory. Rows of chairs faced a modest stage decorated with banners from the Oregon Department of Community Development. The event was formal but not extravagant, just the way Arthur preferred things. Still, he looked slightly out of place in his dark jacket and bolo tie, surrounded by suits and evening gowns. The Mitchell Green Foundation had just completed its first year of operation, and word of its success had reached far beyond the Oregon valleys. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras glinting, pens poised. The night's highlight, honoring Arthur Mitchell with the State Humanitarian Award for Outstanding Contribution to Sustainable Community Development. When his name was called, the applause was immediate and genuine. People stood, veterans, local engineers, foundation staff, even city officials who'd once dismissed his work as sentimental idealism. Arthur rose slowly, adjusting his cuff as Lydia gave him an approving nod. Ethan stood at his side, taller now in posture and spirit, but humble in a way he hadn't been before. Arthur climbed the steps to the podium. The award, a bronze sculpture of interlocking hands, sat beside the microphone. He looked at it briefly, then at the crowd, which had gone perfectly still. "Arthur Mitchell," the host said, smiling broadly. "Builder, engineer, mentor, and visionary. Your cabins have changed how Oregon defines sustainable housing. We're honored to recognize you." Arthur took the award, weighing it for a moment as if testing its balance. Then he leaned toward the microphone, cleared his throat once, and said softly, "I appreciate this." The audience leaned in, waiting for more. But Arthur paused, eyes scanning the faces before him, old friends, former skeptics, and the grandson, who now looked at him not with envy, but respect. "I've spoken enough in my life," he said finally, "but there's someone here who's still learning to speak from where it matters." He turned toward Ethan. "He's the one who should talk tonight." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan froze, eyes wide. "Me?" he mouthed. Arthur handed him the microphone without hesitation. "You've got something worth saying, so say it." Ethan hesitated, his pulse thudding in his ears. He looked out at the expectant faces, reporters, officials, veterans. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the crowd, but his grandfather's steady hand on his shoulder kept him anchored. He took a deep breath. "I don't have a speech," he began, voice shaky. "At first, I didn't know I'd be up here tonight." A few polite laughs helped ease the tension. "So, I guess I'll just say what I should have said a long time ago." He looked at Arthur, his voice gaining strength. "My grandfather built the life I mistook for nothing. When I saw an old truck, I thought poverty. When I saw a small cabin, I thought failure. I was wrong." The room went utterly silent. Ethan continued, the words coming easier now. "He built things that last, things that give instead of take. He taught me that legacy isn't about who remembers your name. It's about what keeps standing after you're gone." A murmur of emotion spread through the audience, a quiet exhale of empathy. Someone in the front row dabbed their eyes. Lydia smiled, her expression half pride, half relief. Ethan turned back to Arthur, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. "You didn't just build cabins," he said softly. "You built people. You built me." He set the microphone down, unable to continue. The audience rose in applause, not the loud, hollow kind meant for cameras, but something deeper, respectful, earned. Arthur stayed seated through most of it, his face unreadable, though his eyes softened behind the stoic calm. When Ethan returned to his seat, Arthur leaned over and said quietly, "That'll do." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for words. Later that night, headlines spread across local and national outlets. "Grandfather's cabin builds legacy. Arthur Mitchell's quiet revolution." The photos showed Arthur holding the bronze award, Ethan beside him, 2 generations caught in a single frame, both smiling in different ways. As the crowd dispersed, Arthur lingered near the window, looking out at the city lights. Lydia joined him, handing him a glass of water. "You handled that well," she said. Arthur smirked. "He handled it better." Across the room, Ethan stood alone for a moment, watching the reflections of the lights ripple against the ballroom floor. His eyes shimmered, not with pride this time, but with peace. He didn't wipe the tears away. He let them fall, quietly, like rain that knew exactly where to land. Arthur watched him, his expression tender, but restrained. "Took him long enough," he murmured. Lydia smiled faintly. "Lessons worth learning always do." The band began to play a slow instrumental tune, piano and strings blending softly under the murmur of conversation. Arthur slipped the award into its box and looked toward the exit. "Let's go home," he said. And as they stepped out into the cool Oregon night, the sound of applause still echoed behind them, fading not into silence, but into something steadier, something that would outlast them both. Morning mist drifted across the surface of Mitchell Lake, curling in thin silver ribbons above the still water. The cabins were quiet, breakfast fires burned low, and the sound of tools hadn't yet begun to echo through the clearing. Arthur sat alone on a weathered bench near the dock, coffee in hand, watching the water move like glass. His reflection shimmered faintly, older and softer than he remembered. Ethan approached quietly from behind, his footsteps muffled by the damp ground. He paused a few yards away, hands in his jacket pockets, heart beating heavier than it should have. For all the speeches he'd given and the crowds he'd faced, this, a single, private moment with the man who'd built him, felt harder than anything. Arthur didn't turn around. "Didn't expect to see you this early," he said, voice steady, low. Ethan took a breath, stepping closer until he stood beside the bench. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too much on my mind." Arthur gestured to the empty spot next to him. "Sit. The lake listens better when you're still." Ethan sat, the old wood creaking under their weight. They both stared at the water for a while, the gentle ripples, the pale morning light stretching over the surface. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Finally, Ethan spoke, the words catching before they formed. I said cruel things, he said quietly. Things I can't take back. Arthur nodded slowly, eyes still on the horizon. You said what youth always says, before time answers back. Ethan let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Guess time's had a lot to say lately. Arthur's mouth twitched in a half smile. It always does. Most folks just don't listen soon enough. They sat there, the quiet wrapping around them again. There was no need for apology rituals or grand gestures. Both men knew words could only do so much. The apology itself was enough. Ethan picked up a small pebble from the shore and tossed it into the lake. It skipped twice before sinking, ripples spreading outward. I kept thinking I'd find the right words, he said. Something that could fix what I broke. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it down beside him. You can't repay me, he said. You just keep building. The simplicity of it struck deep. No forgiveness, no sermon, just truth. Ethan swallowed, eyes burning in the morning chill. I can do that, he said softly. Arthur glanced at him, the sunlight catching the lines around his eyes. Then that's all the apology I need. Ethan nodded, jaw tightening to keep from showing more than he wanted to. His eyes lingered on the horizon, watching the faint shimmer of new sunlight break over the tree line. From the porch of the main cabin, Lydia Rhodes stood watching, coffee mug in hand, an amused smile touching her lips. She'd seen enough of these men to know that reconciliation wasn't made from words. It was made from what came after. She turned to Tom, who had just stepped outside. They're finally talking, she said quietly. Tom smiled. Talking? I don't hear much. That's the point, Lydia replied, still watching them. By the water, Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I don't think I ever really understood you, he said after a while. Not when I was younger, not even a year ago. Arthur's eyes softened. Understanding doesn't come before living, Ethan. It comes after. Ethan nodded again, looking down at his hands, scarred now from months of work, roughened in a way that felt almost like inheritance. You really think I can keep this going? Arthur didn't answer right away. He just looked out across the cabins, their roofs catching the morning sun, smoke rising from the chimneys like signals of new life. You already are, he said finally. Ethan followed his gaze, the sight stirring something quiet and steady inside him. For the first time, he felt not like a guest in his grandfather's world, but part of it. They sat in silence as the light grew stronger, gold spilling across the lake. No grand forgiveness was spoken, no tears shed. Just two men breathing the same calm morning air, bound by what they'd built together. Behind them, Lydia smiled faintly, turning to head back inside. They'll be fine, she murmured. And she was right, because sometimes peace doesn't announce itself. It just settles in softly, like sunlight breaking through fog. The morning air carried a brightness that only late summer in Oregon could manage, sharp, clean, touched with pine. The cabins at Mitchell Creek shimmered beneath it, their roofs still slick with dew, the lake behind them mirroring the sky. For once, the place was calm. No workers, no cameras, no noise, just quiet and light. Arthur stood by the porch, leaning on his walking stick, when the sound of tires on gravel reached his ears. A silver sedan came into view, moving slowly along the winding path. He didn't need to see who was inside. The way the car hesitated before the turn told him everything. Sarah stepped out, dressed neatly but not extravagantly, a woman still caught between city polish and rural hesitation. She closed the door softly, eyes scanning the property as if she'd stumbled into another world. Arthur smiled faintly. You found it. She turned at the sound of his voice, and for a long second, she just stared at him. The wind caught strands of her hair, pulling them across her face. I had to see it for myself, she said finally. Arthur nodded once, as if he'd been expecting that exact answer. Come on then, he said gently. Walk with me. They moved slowly through the clearing, past rows of finished cabins. The scent of cedar and earth surrounded them. Birds darted between the branches, and the faint hum of the generators played beneath it all, a low, steady rhythm of life. Sarah stopped near the first cabin and pressed a hand against its wall. The wood was warm beneath her fingers. "All these years," she said softly, "I thought you hid from us, that you were angry." Arthur turned toward her, eyes kind but firm. "No," he said. "I was waiting for you to see past what glittered." Her throat tightened. She looked at the row of cabins, the glass catching sunlight like jewels. "You built all this for strangers?" Arthur smiled. "For people who needed a place to start again. That used to be me once." She swallowed hard, emotion welling in her voice. "You could have told us, Dad." He shook his head. "If I had, you'd have looked, but not seen." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She laughed through it, embarrassed, wiping at her face. "You always had a way of saying things that hurt and heal at the same time." Arthur chuckled. "That's how lessons work." They walked further along the trail, their pace slow and easy. Sarah reached out, and after a moment's hesitation, Arthur took her hand. The gesture was small, but it bridged years of silence, all the missed birthdays, the letters never sent, the pride too heavy to name. "Tell me about them," she said. "The veterans?" "Yes." Arthur smiled faintly. "They build, they teach, they live. That's all I ever wanted for anyone under this roof." As they reached the last cabin, Ethan appeared from the workshop, his hands dusty, a hammer still hooked to his belt. He froze for a moment when he saw his mother, surprise flickering into warmth. "Mom," he said, wiping his palms on his jeans as he walked over. She smiled through her tears. "You didn't tell me it was this beautiful." He shrugged, a small laugh breaking the tension. "Didn't think words could do it justice." Arthur stood between them, his gaze moving from daughter to grandson. 2 generations of the same stubbornness, now softened by time and understanding. Lydia watched from the cabin porch, camera in hand. She didn't call out, didn't pose them, didn't direct. She just lifted the lens and captured it. 3 figures walking hand in hand along the sunlit trail, framed by pine trees and sky. The shutter clicked softly, barely louder than the breeze. In that single image, the father, the daughter, the grandson, everything that had been broken now stood whole again. No words, no ceremony, just presence. Lydia lowered the camera, smiling to herself. "Legacy," she whispered, "sealed." Arthur paused near the lake's edge, looking out over the water. The reflection of the cabins shimmered beside them, glowing like memory made visible. He exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more peace than pride. "Come on," he said softly. "There's still more to see." And as they walked on, 3 hands joined against the light. The ripples on the water followed quietly, carrying the story forward. The light that afternoon slanted low through Arthur's cabin windows, golden and quiet, catching dust in the air like suspended time. The table was cleared of blueprints and tools for once, replaced with legal folders, a notary stamp, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. Lydia Rhodes sat opposite Arthur, her glasses resting low on her nose as she reviewed the documents line by line. Her pen tapped lightly against the margin. Ethan stood near the window, arms crossed, restless. The silence felt heavier than usual. Outside, the lake reflected the late-day sun, calm and certain. Inside, everything was about to shift. Arthur leaned forward, steadying his hand as he signed the first page. 80%, Lydia said softly, confirming the line. "All holdings, patents, and residual investments. To the Mitchell Green Foundation, effective immediately." Ethan turned, incredulous. 80%, you'll have nothing left." Arthur didn't look up. He signed the next line, then set the pen down for a moment to flex his hand. "Then I'll finally match what you thought of me," he said evenly. The room froze around the words, not cruel, not sharp, but devastating in their calmness. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed again. He exhaled through his nose, trying to find the balance between guilt and admiration. "That's not what I think anymore," he said finally, voice low. Arthur smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't lift from the page. No, he said, but it's what you needed to think once. That's what started all this. Lydia looked up from the documents, watching the exchange in silence. The truth of Arthur's words lingered like smoke, painful, necessary, real. She slid the next set of papers toward him. Initial here, she said. Arthur picked up the pen again. His hand shook slightly, but the signature came out smooth, deliberate. Every mark on the paper felt like a chapter closing. Ethan moved closer to the table, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and affection. You don't have to do this. The Foundation already has enough. You earned this money, all of it. Arthur finally looked up. His expression wasn't stern. It was serene. I earned it to use it, he said, and I'm using it. Ethan sank into the chair across from him, rubbing the back of his neck. You'll keep something, though, right? A backup plan? Arthur chuckled softly, reaching for his coffee. Just my truck, he said, and this cabin. Ethan blinked. That's it? That's enough. The old man leaned back, taking in the sight of his surroundings. The worn timber beams, the tools hanging neatly on hooks, the faint sound of the lake outside. I've had enough roofs, Ethan, he said. Now it's time to make sure other people have theirs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lydia continued her quiet work, stamping, notarizing, sealing, the crisp click of paper and metal, marking each step of something final. Ethan's eyes glassed over as he watched his grandfather's hand move with unwavering purpose. I used to think revenge was about getting even, he murmured. Arthur smiled. It is, but sometimes even means peace. Ethan laughed then, a short, breathless sound that cracked into something deeper. Arthur joined him, both of them chuckling through the heaviness, the kind of laughter that comes when irony feels like grace. Poetic, Lydia said with a half smile, setting the final paper down for signing. Arthur nodded, signing one last time. That's what I was aiming for. When it was done, Lydia stamped the final seal with a sharp, satisfying thunk. She straightened the papers, placing them neatly into the folder. It's official, she said. The Foundation now owns the majority of your estate. Arthur exhaled, slow and steady, as though releasing the last of his burdens, into the quiet. Lydia studied him for a moment. You sure you're ready to let it all go? Arthur turned toward the window, where the sunlight glinted off the lake. I let it go a long time ago, he said. This just makes it legal. Ethan stood beside him, looking out at the reflection of the cabins in the water, his grandfather's legacy stretching beyond ownership, beyond wealth. You really don't keep anything for yourself? He asked softly. Arthur smiled. You're here, aren't you? Ethan swallowed, a tremor in his voice. Yeah. Then I kept the right thing. Lydia packed her folder, closing it with a snap. All done, she said. The rest is in your hands now, Ethan. Both of you. Arthur turned back toward the table, his gaze steady. Revenge complete, he said, almost to himself. Then softer. Replaced by meaning. Ethan looked at him, the man who'd turned insult into purpose, who'd built legacy from silence, and nodded. I get it now, he said quietly. Finally. Arthur's lips curved into the smallest smile. Took you long enough. Outside, the lake shimmered gold as the sun began to set, reflecting the cabins like stars caught in water. The old man's reflection lingered there too, diminished in possessions, but richer than he'd ever been. And though the papers were signed, the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Winter came early that year. The pine forest that surrounded Mitchell Creek fell silent under the first heavy snow, the kind that muted every sound except the slow, deliberate crackle of frost settling on branches. The lake froze around the edges, glassy and perfect, while the cabins stood like lanterns in the white landscape, their windows glowing with soft amber light, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Arthur Mitchell sat near the cabin's front window, pen in hand, his reading glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. The fire behind him flickered, its warmth brushing against the walls like an old friend. On the table lay his worn leather ledger, the same one that had once held lists of debts, names crossed out in anger, notes of betrayal and patience. But tonight, there was only one page left. He stared at it for a long time, the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. Then, in slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote the words that had been forming in him for months: respect, rebuilt. He underlined it once, then set the pen down. His reflection in the window caught his eye, older, quieter, but content. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, scattering flakes against the windowpane. The cabins below shimmered faintly, their paths lit by soft bulbs powered by the solar grid he'd built. In each one, someone new was finding peace. Veterans, families, workers who'd lost everything and found it again in wood and purpose. A knock sounded on the door. Arthur didn't need to ask who it was. Ethan stepped in, bundled in a thick coat, snow dusting his shoulders. "You keeping warm?" he asked, brushing off his gloves. Arthur smiled faintly. "Warmer than I deserve." Ethan laughed, moving closer to the fire. "You say that every time." They sat together for a while, saying little. Words had become unnecessary between them. Ethan poured coffee from the kettle, setting a cup in front of his grandfather before taking a seat opposite him. "You still writing?" he asked, nodding toward the ledger. Arthur nodded once. "Last entry," he said. "Had to finish it before the year turned." Ethan looked at the page, reading the words. "Respect rebuilt," he said quietly. "That's it?" Arthur's eyes glimmered with amusement. "Sometimes a lifetime fits in 2 words." Ethan leaned back, letting the fire's warmth seep into his bones. "I think you rebuilt more than respect." Arthur smiled faintly, gaze fixed on the flames. "Maybe, but that's the one that mattered most." Outside, snow continued to fall in thick, soft waves. Down the path, Tom Alvarez worked under the dim light of a lantern, hammering a final plank into the rebuilt pier. Each strike echoed through the stillness, rhythmic and sure, the same way Arthur had worked for decades. Further up the trail, Sarah stood beside a truck filled with boxes labeled Mitchell Foundation Winter Drive. She directed volunteers with practiced efficiency, her breath visible in the cold air. What began as guilt had become devotion. She'd turned her father's legacy into action. From the porch, Lydia watched it all unfold, her gloved hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The valley looked almost unreal. Cabins aglow, paths clear, snow untouched beyond the property line. She turned back toward the cabin, smiling. "You did it, Arthur," she murmured. Inside, Arthur's eyes were heavy, but his spirit felt light. He leaned back in his chair, the fire painting gold across his face. "Looks like they're doing fine without me," he said softly. Ethan smiled. "You built something that didn't need you forever." Arthur's gaze drifted to the compass on the mantel, the same one he'd once gifted to Ethan. The needle pointed north, steady and unwavering. "That's the goal," he whispered. Ethan followed his gaze, his throat tightening. "You ever think about stopping?" Arthur chuckled. "Stopping's for people who didn't start right." The old man rose slowly, walking toward the window. The valley spread out beneath him, hundreds of lights glowing in the dark, cabins like stars scattered across the snow. Each one was a promise kept, a wrong made right. Ethan joined him at the window. Neither spoke. They just watched as the wind carried a swirl of snow over the lake, the light reflecting off it like glittering dust. "Beautiful," Ethan said finally. Arthur nodded. "Peaceful," he corrected. Behind them, the fire popped softly, a single ember rising toward the chimney. Arthur turned away, setting a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Keep it that way," he said. "That's all the inheritance I've got left." Ethan nodded. "I will." Arthur smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. "Good. Then I can rest easy when the snow melts." He turned back toward the fire, the warmth painting him in light. Outside, the valley glowed brighter, a constellation of cabins shining against the white, pulsing with life. As the camera pulled back, through the glass, over the trees, across the frozen lake, the entire foundation came into view, a glowing valley of light in the quiet Oregon winter. The morning started clear, cold, and deceptively calm. Arthur was walking the edge of the property with Ethan and Tom, clipboard in hand, as they inspected the new cabins built through the winter. Frost clung to the grass, crunching beneath their boots. Arthur moved slower than usual, but no one thought much of it. He'd always been steady, unshakable, like the land itself. They were halfway down the trail when it happened. Arthur stopped mid-step, his hand clutching the clipboard tighter. For a moment, his gaze drifted unfocused toward the lake. "Just need a second," he muttered, but the words came softer than usual. His legs wavered, the color draining from his face. "Grandpa," Ethan called out, dropping the plans he'd been carrying. Arthur swayed once, then folded gently to the ground. Tom was beside him in seconds, steadying his shoulders. Ethan's pulse surged as he knelt, shaking his grandfather's arm. Hey, stay with me." Arthur's eyes fluttered open for a moment, his breath shallow but calm. "Stop shouting, boy," he whispered. "You'll wake the trees." Ethan exhaled sharply, half in fear, half in relief. "You're joking? Now?" But Arthur's eyes rolled closed again. Tom's voice cut through the cold air. "Truck's by the shed. We'll take him to Bend." Ethan nodded, already lifting his grandfather's arm over his shoulder. The drive down the mountain was frantic, the old pickup rattling around each bend. The sound of the engine mixed with Ethan's ragged breathing. He kept glancing toward the passenger seat, where Arthur lay reclined, pale but faintly smiling. "Don't you dare," Ethan said under his breath, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Not like this. Not after everything." Arthur stirred. "Drive slower," he muttered. "You're scaring the deer." Ethan let out a nervous laugh, part fear, part disbelief. "You're unbelievable." By the time they reached the hospital, Lydia was already there, her hair windblown, eyes sharp with concern. She'd gotten the call from Tom and met them at the entrance, her lawyer's composure slipping just enough to reveal real worry. They wheeled Arthur into a small exam room, monitors beeping quietly. The doctor arrived quickly, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes and the kind of tone that diffused panic. She checked Arthur's vitals, flipped through his chart, then looked at the family gathered around. "He's fine," she said after a pause. "Exhaustion, mostly. Dehydration, stress. He needs rest, not heroics." Ethan's shoulders sagged. "That's it?" "That's it," she confirmed, smiling gently. "Though I'll tell you, most men half his age don't have this kind of stamina." Arthur opened one eye, voice hoarse but playful. "Can't retire twice," he said. Lydia let out a breath, somewhere between relief and laughter. "You scared us half to death." Arthur shrugged. "Good to know I'm still effective." Ethan sat beside the bed, his earlier panic dissolving into something quieter. "You could have told me you weren't feeling well," he said softly. Arthur looked at him, his expression faintly amused. "And miss seeing you panic for once?" Ethan chuckled despite himself. "You really are impossible." Arthur smiled, his tone softening. "Maybe, but so were you once." Lydia shook her head, smiling faintly. "Some things run too deep to change." The doctor gave them another reassuring nod before leaving the room, promising to return with discharge papers. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the three of them in a bubble of quiet relief. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You know," he said slowly, "for a minute out there, I thought—" He stopped, the rest unspoken. Arthur finished it for him. "That I was done?" Ethan nodded. Arthur's voice gentled. "Not yet, son. There's still wood left to cut." Ethan smiled through the ache in his chest. "Then promise me you'll rest." Arthur's gaze softened. "Don't overbuild, Ethan. Not even good men can carry the whole foundation." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than the words said. "I won't." Lydia stepped closer, placing the signed paperwork for discharge on the table. "You two sound like old poets," she said, half teasing, half tender. Arthur smiled. "We're builders. Same thing." Outside, snow began to fall again, faint and weightless, dusting the hospital window in light. Ethan watched his grandfather close his eyes, peaceful but not fragile. A man worn down by time, but still unbroken. Mutual respect hung between them, quiet and certain, forged not by words, but by the shared understanding of everything they'd built, and everything they still had left to finish. By late spring, the Mitchell Green Foundation had become something larger than Arthur ever imagined. What began as a quiet act of redemption now stretched across headlines, research papers, and social media feeds. The cabins had become a model for sustainable housing, and the story, his story, had reached far beyond Oregon's borders. It was only a matter of time before a documentary crew arrived. They came on a Tuesday morning, their white van bouncing down the gravel road that led into the valley. The crew spilled out, producers, sound techs, and a young director named Claire, who carried both a camera and a kind of reverence. They greeted Ethan warmly, shaking hands, eyes wide, as they took in the sight of the cabins glowing under the early light. "This is even more beautiful in person," Claire said, lifting her lens toward the ridge where Arthur's old cabin stood. "He really built all this?" Ethan smiled faintly. "He built the first one. The rest, well, he built the people who did." Claire grinned. "That's the line I'll use in the intro." Arthur was nowhere to be found at first. Lydia suspected he'd vanished intentionally. He never liked cameras. "He'll show up when he's ready," she told them. "He always does." Ethan took charge of the interviews. They set up on the porch of one of the newer cabins overlooking the lake. A microphone clipped to his shirt, a camera trained on his face, and beyond him, the reflection of the forest in the water, still and eternal. Claire's first question was simple. When people hear about the Mitchell Foundation, they think of innovation, sustainability, legacy. But for you, what does this place mean? Ethan hesitated, searching for words. He wasn't rehearsed. He didn't need to be. "It means patience," he said at last, "and forgiveness. My grandfather called it a small cabin, but what he really built were big lessons. About work, humility, and about seeing things that don't shine." The crew was silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Claire smiled softly. "Did he ever imagine all this?" Ethan shook his head. "He never built to be seen. He built so others could stand. That's what makes this place real. It's not a monument. It's a mirror." Behind the camera, Lydia folded her arms, listening quietly. She'd seen Ethan grow from arrogance to understanding, from taking to giving. Now, his words didn't just honor Arthur, they carried him forward. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement near the tree line. Arthur had emerged from the woods, wearing his usual flannel and work boots, a coffee mug in hand. He stood just far enough to stay out of frame, watching as his grandson spoke. Ethan continued, voice steady but full. "He used to say, 'You can't sell foundations.' I didn't understand that for a long time. But now, I think he meant that the best things you build aren't meant to be bought. They're meant to last." The cameraman lowered his rig for a moment, exhaling. "That's your closing line right there," he murmured. Ethan smiled slightly, realizing the interview was almost done. "He's the reason any of this exists," he said softly. "If you really want to tell this story, tell his." Off camera, Arthur leaned against a post, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lydia glanced at him, whispering, "You proud?" Arthur chuckled under his breath. "He's learned." She turned toward him. "So have you." He nodded once, eyes still on Ethan. "Took both of us long enough." The crew began to pack up as the light changed, golden rays cutting through the tall Oregon pines, filtering through the mist that hovered above the lake. Claire called out a thank you, promising to send a preview of the footage before release. Ethan looked toward the tree line, spotting Arthur half hidden in the glow. Their eyes met, and no words passed between them. They didn't need to. As the camera rolled one last time for a wide shot, the valley stretched across the screen, cabins gleaming, lake shimmering, forest breathing. The lens pulled back slowly, the pines swaying like sentinels in the wind. The narrator would later say the line over the final frame. Sometimes, the quietest builders leave the loudest legacies. But in that moment, there was no narration, just the faint sound of the wind, and two generations standing in the same light, teacher and student, both still learning. The morning light crept gently through the cabin window, golden and soft, the kind that carried no rush, No sound, just peace. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the roof, the steady rhythm of water against wood, marking another quiet spring morning in Mitchell Creek. Inside, the fire from the night before had died down to embers, their faint orange glow flickering against the stone hearth. Arthur Mitchell didn't stir. He lay in his chair by the window, wrapped in his old wool blanket, glasses still perched on the edge of his nose. His hands were folded neatly across his chest, one of them holding something. The small brass compass he'd once given to Ethan years ago, the one that had found its way back to him not long ago. The needle quivered faintly in the morning draft, always pointing north. Lydia Rhodes arrived just after dawn, her boots crunching over the frosted ground. She'd come to deliver new documents for the foundation, expansion plans, funding reports, the endless movement of life Arthur had set in motion. She knocked lightly, then let herself in. "Arthur?" she called softly. No answer. Her gaze fell on him by the window, the morning light tracing the lines of his face. He looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. A quietness that was final, not resting. Lydia stepped closer, her eyes glistening even before her mind fully caught up. She knelt beside him, her breath catching as she saw the compass in his hand. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, voice trembling. "You old fox. You did it your way, didn't you?" She reached out and touched his hand, still warm, but unmoving. The peace on his face told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't struggled. He hadn't slipped away in fear. He'd simply stopped, the same way he'd lived, quietly, deliberately, leaving behind the kind of silence that hums with meaning. She stood, steadying herself. Her hand hovered over the compass, then withdrew. It didn't belong to her, not anymore. She turned to the table where Arthur's ledger still rested, open to the last page he'd written months ago. Respect rebuilt. Lydia exhaled shakily, a soft smile flickering through the sadness. "Yes," she whispered. "It was." She picked up her phone and stepped out onto the porch, where the valley stretched wide under the rising sun. The cabins below glowed faintly in the mist, lights still on from the early risers, smoke curling into the pale sky. She dialed Ethan's number with trembling fingers. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Lydia, everything okay?" Her voice broke before she could stop it. "He's gone, Ethan." A long silence followed. She could hear his breath on the line, sharp, then uneven, then still. "When?" he finally asked, his tone low, reverent. "This morning, peacefully. He was holding your compass." More silence, then faintly, "Of course he was." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, but she smiled anyway. He looked proud, like he'd finished something. Ethan's voice came back softer, cracked by emotion. "He did." A pause, then, "I'll be there soon." When he hung up, Lydia stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sunlight stretch across the frozen lake. A pair of ducks skimmed low over the water, wings slicing the mist. Life continued, gentle and unbothered, exactly as Arthur would have wanted. Ethan arrived an hour later, his truck rumbling softly up the drive. He stepped inside the cabin without a word. The sound of his boots on the wood floor echoed through the stillness. When he saw Arthur, he stopped. Lydia didn't move or speak. She just watched as Ethan knelt beside his grandfather and took his hand, rough, weathered, familiar. His thumb brushed over the brass compass, now cold to the touch. "He left direction," Ethan whispered, voice breaking but steady. "Not distance." Lydia turned away, wiping a tear from her cheek, the words hanging in the quiet like scripture. Outside, the lake reflected the morning sky, calm, endless, rippling with light. The camera panned slowly across the scene, the cabin, the trees, the valley Arthur had built into permanence. And as the light rose higher, the reflection shimmered, a life complete, yet echoing forward, the beginning of legacy. The morning of the funeral arrived quiet and pale, the kind of gray that softens everything it touches. Snow had begun to fall in slow, gentle flakes, blanketing the pines and cabins in white. The air held that fragile stillness only winter mornings know, neither sadness nor peace, just pause. A small crowd gathered on the grounds near Arthur's cabin. No church bells, no speeches over grand podiums, just people, bundled in coats and scarves, breath clouding the cold air. Veterans from the retreat stood side by side with the builders who'd helped raise the cabins. Workers, family, and friends formed a semicircle around a simple wooden casket set on a stand near the frozen lake. Lydia had kept the arrangements humble, just as Arthur would have wanted. No floral excess, no marble, just cedar planks, hand-sanded by Tom and Ethan themselves. The scent of the wood still lingered, clean and honest. Ethan stood near the front, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, the compass hanging from a chain around his neck. He hadn't slept much since that morning. Didn't want to. Rest could wait until the valley said goodbye. Sarah stood beside him, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. Her eyes were swollen but steady. Behind them, Lydia held the old leather ledger close to her chest, the pages fluttering faintly in the breeze. Tom stepped forward first, his voice low but strong. Arthur Mitchell wasn't a man who built for applause, he began. He built for silence, for the kind that comes when the work is good and the day is done. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan took a step forward next, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket, but never looking at it. His breath hung in the air as he spoke. "My grandfather wasn't broke," he said, voice trembling slightly. "He was full of patience, of plans, of lessons I didn't deserve but got anyway." He glanced toward the casket, his throat tightening. "He built things out of wood and out of people, things that lasted, things that taught you to look twice before judging what looked small." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan continued softer. "He used to say, wealth wasn't about what you keep. It's about what you give away before you go. I didn't understand that until now." He looked toward his mother. "Mom has something to read," he said, stepping back. Sarah unfolded a small piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly. Her voice carried softly over the crowd. "These are his words," she said, glancing up at the gray sky. "Wealth is what remains when money's gone. It's the respect you've earned, the hands you've helped, the roofs you've raised. That's what outlives you." A quiet sob came from somewhere in the crowd. Sarah lowered the paper slowly, her voice cracking just once as she whispered, "That's who he was." Lydia stepped forward next, opening the ledger Arthur had kept for so many years. The inked pages fluttered in the wind. Names, stories, the traces of a lifetime written by a steady hand. She turned to the final page, where the last words stood clean and unshaken. Respect rebuilt. With a trembling breath, she closed the ledger. The sound of it shutting was soft, but final, the kind of sound that carries weight without needing echo. Snow continued to fall, gentler now, dusting the casket, the boots of those gathered, the roofs of the cabins beyond. The wind whispered through the trees, the lake beneath them half frozen, but glimmering in the pale light. Removed his cap, bowing his head. The veterans saluted, silent and still. Ethan stared at the casket, tears finally slipping free, his chest rising with a shaky breath. "You did it, Grandpa," he murmured. "You finished everything." Lydia placed the closed ledger atop the casket. Sarah reached out, resting her gloved hand beside it. Ethan followed, his palm pressing against the cool wood. 3 hands, family, friend, student, united in farewell. The snow thickened, each flake catching the faint sunlight as it fell. The scene looked almost unreal, the white world holding its breath for the man who had built something that would not fade. As the camera panned back, the cabins glowed faintly in the distance, their lights golden against the cold. No words followed, no music swelled, just the hush of snow, the steady breath of the valley, and the quiet sense that this wasn't an ending. It was a continuation of work, of legacy, of light. The sky over Mitchell Creek was clear again, that soft silver blue of early spring that hinted at renewal. Snow still clung to the shaded corners of the valley, but most of it had melted, feeding the lake until it shimmered like glass. The cabins stood quietly, their lights dim in the morning calm, waiting for the next chapter to begin. Inside the foundation office, once Arthur's old workshop, Dust danced in the sunlight, spilling through the wide windows. The scent of cedar lingered in the air, mixed with coffee and the faint smell of ink. On the desk sat a single brass compass. Its surface had dulled with age, edges worn smooth from decades of use. The needle trembled faintly with every movement in the room, as if still alive. Ethan sat behind the desk, sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He ran a finger over the compass face, the initials AM, barely visible on the back. He exhaled softly, then placed the compass flat on the drafting table beside a large sheet of blue-lined paper. He aligned it with the edge of the page, adjusted the ruler, and began to draw. The pencil moved slow, steady, measured like breath. Each line he drew was deliberate, like the echo of his grandfather's old rhythm. It wasn't the first time he'd drawn a blueprint, but it was the first time it felt right. Lydia Rhodes appeared in the doorway, coat draped over her arm, her hair silvering in the morning light. "You're here early," she said, her voice warm but teasing. Ethan smiled without looking up. "Old habits die hard, I guess." She stepped closer, watching as he continued his work. "That's new," she said, nodding toward the compass. He glanced at it briefly, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "Yeah, figured it should stay here. Feels like it belongs." Lydia nodded slowly. "Direction suits you." Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He'd hate this, you know. All the attention. The reporters, the awards, the documentaries. Lydia smirked. Maybe, but he'd love the accuracy. The two shared a quiet laugh, the kind that didn't need to fill silence. It just settled in it comfortably. Ethan leaned forward again, adjusting the compass. "We're calling this one Cabin 2, he said. "The veterans helped design it. Wider doorways, better insulation, more space for community gatherings." Lydia smiled. He'd be proud. Ethan's pencil paused for a moment. His gaze softened as he looked at the faint lines he'd drawn, the bones of something that didn't yet exist but already felt alive. "You know," he said, "I used to think he built all this because he wanted to prove something. To us. To the world." Lydia tilted her head. "And now?" He looked up at her. "Now I think he built it so we'd have something to continue." Lydia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then keep continuing." Ethan smiled. "That's the plan." She turned toward the door, pausing before leaving. "Don't let the compass do all the work," she said over her shoulder. "Sometimes you have to trust where you're standing." He watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. The room felt still again, the only sound, the faint scratch of pencil against paper. Ethan looked down at the compass once more, his reflection faint in its glass. "He'd probably tell me I'm drawing too slow," he murmured with a small smile. The compass needle wavered slightly, catching a beam of sunlight as if answering him. He laughed quietly under his breath and went back to his work, tracing out the last line of the new blueprint. At the bottom corner, he wrote in steady handwriting, Cabin 2, MGF Expansion Project. The initials stood for Mitchell Green Foundation, but as he looked at them, Ethan knew they meant something deeper. Mitchell. Generations. Forward. He set down his pencil, leaned back, and looked out the window. The cabins glowed faintly in the distance, quiet, enduring, alive. The camera lingered on the compass, the sunlight glinting off its face. Then it panned slowly to the blueprint spread across the table, precise, clean, and full of promise. At the bottom, just beneath the project name, the compass's shadow fell across the words like a seal of approval. Cabin 2, the next beginning. Evening settled over Mitchell Creek like a benediction. The last traces of daylight stretched across the Oregon mountains, bleeding into a soft amber glow that touched every rooftop, every pine branch, every ripple on the lake. A slow aerial view revealed the valley below. A cluster of cabins blanketed in snow, their lights flickering on one by one. Warm gold against endless white. The camera glided above it all, the paths between cabins glowing faintly, the solar panels reflecting the sky like pieces of glass. In the center of it stood the original cabin, smaller than the rest, but somehow grander in its simplicity. The place where everything began. Ethan, sail. Mitchell walked the snow-covered trail leading to it, his breath fogging in the cold. He carried a small lantern in one hand, the old brass compass in the other. The sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground was steady, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat against the hush of winter. He stopped at the porch and looked up. The cabin stood exactly as Arthur had left it, the same timber beams, the same hand-carved sign above the door that read Mitchell Creek Cabin. Snow clung to the roof, the wood dark with time. Ethan exhaled deeply, his breath drifting upward like smoke. He stepped inside. The air was still warm from the wood stove, faintly scented with cedar and coffee. The old chair by the window remained in its place, the ledger resting on the nearby table. Ethan set the lantern down and moved to the fireplace, striking a match. The flame caught quickly, spreading through the dry logs until the room filled with light. He stood there for a long moment, watching the fire take shape. The light flickered across the compass in his hand, dancing across its brass surface. And then, softly, the voiceover began. Ethan's voice, calm, steady, filled with the weight of memory. He thought I was broke. I was just rich in patience. The fire cracked as the words echoed. Outside, the valley lights mirrored the sky, and from above, it looked as though stars had fallen and decided to stay. Ethan turned the compass over in his hand, tracing the engraved initials, AM. He smiled faintly. "Still points north," he whispered. The door creaked open behind him. Sarah stepped in, bundled in a wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She said nothing at first, just stood beside him, her eyes on the fire. "He'd like this," she said finally. Ethan nodded. "He'd say we use too much light," he said with a quiet laugh. Sarah smiled through her tears. "And then he'd fix it himself." From outside came the crunch of boots, Lydia and Tom approaching, carrying 2 more lanterns. Lydia paused at the threshold, watching the siblings by the fire. "Couldn't let you have the last word without witnesses," she teased softly. Tom set a lantern on the porch rail, nodding toward the glowing cabins below. "Looks like the lights are holding steady," he said. "They'll hold," Ethan replied, his tone certain. The 4 of them stood together in the cabin, not as mourners, but as builders. The fire popped and hissed, its light painting gold across the wood-paneled walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, the flakes catching the light like sparks frozen in air. Ethan lifted the compass one last time, holding it near the window. The needle quivered, pointing toward the lake, toward the legacy Arthur had left behind. He turned to Lydia, Sarah, and Tom. "He built this place for people to find their way," he said quietly. "Now it's our turn to keep them on course." Lydia smiled. "Then let's not drift." They all looked out through the wide cabin window. Beyond it, the entire valley shimmered. Rows of cabins glowing against the snow, their reflections rippling across the still dark lake. The camera slowly pulled back, the image widening until the cabins became a constellation of light spread across the earth. As Ethan reached for the lantern to dim it for the night, the faint reflection of Arthur's cabin flickered in the water. Small, golden, eternal. A final line appeared across the screen as the music swelled softly, not triumphant, but tender, resolute. The small cabin that rebuilt a family. The lights shimmered once more, then faded to black.